Chapter 1. The Arrival of the Invitation. The village of Willowbrook had always been a place of gentle routines and familiar faces, where the seasons seemed to pass with quiet dignity, and the faint scent of roses and honeysuckle drifted from garden to garden. On that particular morning, however, the delicate balance of village life was disturbed by a peculiar piece of mail, one that arrived at the grand yet aging Ashcroft Manor. The envelope was creamy and thick, sealed with a wax emblem that bore no immediate name but suggested a certain weight of importance. It lay on the polished oak hall table, the corners slightly curled, as though anticipating the response of the person who would open it. Inside was an invitation, formal, somber, and disturbingly precise. It announced a funeral, scheduled for the following week, and requested the presence of the addressee in an unmistakably insistent tone. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window in her small Willowbrook cottage, observed the world outside with the kind of calm attentiveness that only comes from years of watching human nature in its myriad forms. Birds hopped cautiously along the edges of the garden path, and the distant chatter of villagers, carrying both curiosity and the faint undertone of gossip, reached her ears. She had seen countless disturbances over her lifetime, from minor domestic quarrels to the occasional scandal, and she had learned to measure words, actions, and the spaces between them. Even before she had opened the letter herself, she sensed the peculiar tension that such invitations carried, a mixture of grief, obligation, and often the potential for discord. The envelope had been delivered by the postman, a young man who was unfamiliar with the Ashcroft family's particular ways, and who handed it over with a slight hesitation, noting, as he always did, the heavy importance of certain houses in the village. "Seems formal, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting the strap of his bag. "You can feel that it's meant for someone who's, well, important." Miss Marple accepted the envelope without comment, her keen eyes already tracing the wax seal and the faint embossing of the letters. There was a certain precision to it, she observed, a deliberate choice of paper and ink, the careful folding of the edges. These were not the careless touches of ordinary correspondence. Someone had considered how this invitation would be received. There was intent here, and with intent came the potential for human emotion to run high. She carried the letter over to her small desk, where her spectacles rested, and unfolded it gently, as one might unearth an artifact. The words themselves were not extraordinary, yet the tone carried an unmistakable chill. A funeral was to be held at Ashcroft Manor, and the presence of the recipient was deemed necessary. Beyond this, the letter was curiously devoid of sentiment. No mention of the deceased's name, no gentle preamble, only the stark and formal announcement, as though the writer wished to communicate duty rather than mourning. Miss Marple set the letter down and leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly steepled beneath her chin. She did not need to hurry. The village was still and quiet, yet she sensed the beginnings of a ripple, a subtle disturbance that would grow in time. Willowbrook was small, and news traveled quickly. An event such as this, wrapped in mystery and lacking explanation, would provoke speculation, whispers, and, inevitably, conflicting accounts. Even now, she could picture the scene in the village. Mrs. Pennington at the tea-rooms, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had seen the envelope being delivered, adding her own conjectures about what it might mean. The postmistress, perhaps, repeating what she had heard, inadvertently embellishing details with each retelling. Children playing in the lane, imagining ghostly figures and shadowy secrets. And the elderly men at the inn, shaking their heads and debating who among the villagers might be involved, each theory more implausible than the last. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truth often lay hidden in these small, seemingly insignificant reactions, tiny gestures, fleeting expressions, or an unusual choice of words. She glanced again at the invitation. There was no signature, only a stylized monogram pressed into the wax seal. Miss Marple was not immediately concerned with who had sent it, though her curiosity was piqued. Instead, she considered the implications. An event calling several individuals together, a gathering steeped in sorrow but also potential tension, and a location, a manor house, that had not been used publicly in many years. Ashcroft Manor was grand and imposing, its stone walls and high windows hiding countless secrets accumulated over generations. Miss Marple knew well enough that old houses held echoes, shadows of human emotion, lingering disputes, and memories that did not fade. With a small sigh, She set the envelope aside and prepared herself. There was no need to rush. The funeral was days away, and she preferred to observe quietly, to let the story unfold at its own pace. She imagined walking through the village in the coming days, noting reactions, listening for odd turns of phrase, paying attention to pauses in conversation, the way hands might twitch nervously or eyes dart subtly. Human nature was consistent, after all, and there was little one could do to conceal the truth entirely. The afternoon sun was waning when she finally rose and moved toward the window. Through the glass, she saw the first signs of disturbance as a horse-drawn cart passed by, its cargo of hay kicking up dust along the lane. A few villagers paused to watch, their attention divided between curiosity and the habitual concern for their own small affairs. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Soon, the arrival of the letter would be on everyone's lips, and she would have much to observe. By the time twilight began to settle over Willowbrook, the invitation had become the topic of hushed conversations across the village. Mrs. Pennington's afternoon gathering at the tea-rooms was in full swing, and she spoke with deliberate emphasis of the envelope, describing its weight, its appearance, and the mystery of the unsigned sender. "It's for Ashcroft Manor," she insisted, her voice lowering with dramatic intensity. "I've never known a letter like this, so formal, so chilling." Across the room, Mrs. Finch shook her head, her rosiness a mask for curiosity and fear. "A funeral without a name? Surely, someone ought to have explained. Something is amiss. I do wonder if there's more behind this than we know." And so, as the sun dipped fully behind the hills, the village of Willowbrook hummed with anticipation, gossip, and quiet trepidation. Miss Marple, sitting in the corner with her tea, stirred gently, not reacting, but absorbing everything. The letter lay before her, an unassuming piece of paper, yet one that would catalyze a sequence of events revealing hidden motives, long-buried secrets, and the complex, sometimes dark nature of human behavior. In her mind, Miss Marple began mapping out the threads she would follow: the manor's layout, the villagers' connections to the Ashcroft family, the subtle cues that betrayed anxiety or duplicity, and the histories that each resident carried with them. She understood, with quiet certainty, that while the letter itself was simple, its arrival had already begun to ripple through Willowbrook, touching hearts, minds, and perhaps, unknowingly, setting into motion events that could lead to consequences no one yet imagined. By nightfall, the village had grown silent under the blanket of dusk, the streets empty, save for a few lamps casting pools of soft golden light onto cobblestone paths. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple prepared her notebook, a modest collection of observations and impressions accumulated over decades of careful attention. She made no grand declarations, wrote no assumptions, only noting facts, small oddities, and questions that demanded answers. It was in this quiet preparation, the deliberate cataloguing of the mundane and the subtle, that Miss Marple's genius lay. She did not rush to judgment, she did not jump to conclusions, she observed, listened, and waited. Willowbrook would wake tomorrow, the villagers would talk, and the invitation's true implications would unfold, but Miss Marple was already at work in her mind, arranging the pieces of a puzzle that no one else could yet see. And so, as the manor's shadow stretched across the lane, and the first stars appeared in the evening sky, the stage was set for a story of secrets, hidden motives, and revelations that would test the calm intelligence of Miss Marple. The funeral invitation was more than a simple notice. It was the beginning of a tale that would reveal much about human nature, the weight of history, and the quiet, relentless power of observation. Chapter 2. Shadows over Ashcroft Manor. The morning after the arrival of the funeral invitation, Willowbrook seemed quieter than usual, though in truth, it was a tensioned quiet, the kind that precedes curiosity and gossip alike. Miss Marple had already risen early, her routine unchanged, yet her thoughts were entirely occupied with the events that the letter would set in motion. Through her window, she observed the village stirring to life, the baker adjusting loaves in the display window, the postman sorting letters with meticulous care, and the faint hum of wheels on cobblestones as carts carried supplies along the narrow lanes. Yet among the ordinary rhythms, Miss Marple noticed subtle deviations, villagers pausing longer than necessary at the corner shop, glances exchanged with faint suspicion, whispers halting when a stranger passed by. These were the telltale signs of anticipation, the ripple effects that a single object, an envelope, a message, could create within a tightly knit community. Her thoughts returned to Ashcroft Manor, the imposing stone structure that sat like a watchful sentinel atop its hill, its windows catching the early sunlight and reflecting it back in dull, almost sullen glimmers. The manor had always been a place of formality and quiet mystery, but the arrival of the funeral invitation had changed its atmosphere. It was not merely the impending ceremony. It was the precise wording of the letter, the anonymity of its sender, and the careful choice of day and hour that suggested deliberate orchestration. Miss Marple knew well enough that such details were rarely accidental, and in the ordinary lives of Willowbrook's residents, they were sure to provoke curiosity, speculation, and, inevitably, error. She made herself a small cup of tea, stirring gently and letting her eyes wander across the garden. The roses were beginning to bloom, but their fragrance was overlaid by the faint mist rising from the hedges, a reminder that even beauty could conceal secrets beneath its surface. With each sip, she considered the manor's occupants, the Ashcroft family, distant relatives, servants, and neighbors who would attend the funeral. There were connections and histories, known and hidden, and Miss Marple intended to observe them all without haste. By the time the sun had climbed higher in the sky, she set out for a walk through the village, a gentle stroll that allowed her to encounter conversation, witness behavior, and note the ordinary details that most overlooked. Her first stop was the Rose Hill Tea Rooms, where Mrs. Pennington had already gathered a small audience, eager to share the news of the funeral invitation with as much embellishment as decorum allowed. "Can you imagine?" Mrs. Pennington began, her voice a careful mixture of indignation and curiosity. "A funeral for which the letter itself says nothing of who has passed, only that the Ashcrofts must attend. I've never known anything like it." Miss Marple, taking a seat quietly at the corner table, said nothing but listened, her eyes noting the way Mrs. Finch's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, the faint narrowing of Mr. Whitford's eyes as he leaned toward the conversation, and the subtle shift in the posture of the postmistress behind the counter. Every motion, every hesitation, held information, every word, every inflection, provided context. While the villagers debated the potential significance of the invitation, Miss Marple considered the manor itself. She remembered the long corridors, the heavy curtains, the smell of polished wood and old carpets, and the intricate patterns of shadow and light that fell across the halls when the sun shone through the high windows. The manor's secrets, she knew, would reveal themselves only slowly, in the minutiae of daily life and the small mistakes that human beings inevitably made. Leaving the tea-rooms, Miss Marple wandered toward the main lane, where she encountered the postman once more. "I delivered another letter to Ashcroft Manor," he said, smiling faintly. "Nothing as peculiar as yesterday's envelope, but still, there's talk, you know. People are curious." Miss Marple nodded, making no comment, but noting the particular care in his delivery, the hesitation in his tone, and the slight way he glanced back over his shoulder. Even in simple acts, human nature could not fully disguise itself. Her next destination was the village green, where early risers tended to gather. She passed Mrs. Larkins, who was hanging freshly laundered clothes on the line, and noticed the subtle tension in her movements, as if the wind itself carried rumors and suspicion. Children played near the fountain, their laughter carrying on the morning air, yet even they had paused to discuss the envelope, whispering about the funeral and imagining strange scenarios. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. The innocence of youth often saw truths that adults overlooked, if only because it was filtered through imagination rather than experience. Reaching the edge of the manor grounds, she observed Ashcroft Manor from a distance. The great stone facade was imposing, the windows dark in some places, catching sunlight in others, and the wrought-iron gates reflected the morning light with a cold, unyielding sheen. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a stillness that hinted at events yet to come, and Miss Marple recognized the signs immediately. The way the servant appeared briefly at a window before disappearing, the sudden hush of birds as if aware of human tension, the faint movement of curtains as they were adjusted by unseen hands. Every detail mattered, and Miss Marple catalogued them silently. As she circled the manor's perimeter, she noted the garden paths, the overgrown hedges, and the faint footprints in the damp earth, recent, precise, deliberate. She made no move to follow them yet. Observation was the key, and she preferred patience to action. Returning to the village later in the day, Miss Marple visited the local post office. Letters and parcels were sorted with care, and she examined the mail delivered that morning with an unassuming eye, noting nothing overtly suspicious yet absorbing subtle clues: the return addresses, the style of handwriting, the thickness of envelopes, the faint scent of ink and paper. ACH item, each tiny irregularity, added to her understanding of the manor, the Ashcroft family, and the ripple effects of the funeral invitation. By evening, news of the letter had reached nearly every household in Willowbrook. Speculation grew bolder, and Miss Marple observed it all with calm detachment. She watched as villagers discussed theories, each more elaborate than the last. Some speculated on inheritance disputes, others on long-buried family scandals, and a few whispered of misfortune or impending tragedy. Yet beneath the surface chatter, Miss Marple discerned patterns, inconsistencies, and human behavior that no casual observer could detect. That night, she sat by her window once more, reviewing her mental notes. The envelope lay nearby, its edges catching the moonlight. She did not open it again. She had already examined its contents and considered its implications. What mattered now was the sequence of human actions that would follow, the gestures, glances, and choices that would reveal character and motive in ways the letter itself could not. Willowbrook slept uneasily under the silver glow of the moon. The distant outline of Ashcroft Manor cast long shadows across the lane, and a soft mist began to rise from the gardens, curling around hedges and statues. Inside the manor, unseen hands adjusted curtains, moved furniture slightly, and ensured that the house itself seemed prepared for the arrival of visitors, whether living or departed. Miss Marple, in the comfort of her cottage, sipped her tea and prepared her notebook, recording impressions, hypotheses, and questions that demanded answers. The funeral invitation was not merely a summons. It was a catalyst, a thread that, when pulled, would unravel tensions, expose secrets, and challenge the intelligence and patience of all involved. She felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, tempered by her characteristic calm. Observation, thought, and patience, these were her tools, and Willowbrook would soon provide the material for her careful work. The village, the manor, and the envelope formed a triad of intrigue that promised to reveal the depths of human nature, both noble and flawed. Miss Marple, poised in her chair by the window, knew that the days ahead would require careful attention, keen insight, and the ability to interpret subtleties invisible to most. And so, as the first stars appeared in the night sky and the village settled under a blanket of darkness, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting dots, forming hypotheses, and preparing for the arrival of visitors, letters, and revelations that would shape the story of the funeral invitation in ways that no one yet imagined. In the stillness of her cottage, she understood fully that the letter was only the beginning, and that the true mystery lay in human nature, observation, and the unfolding of events that would challenge the small village of Willowbrook and its calm yet discerning resident, Miss Marple. Chapter 3. Unease among the villagers. The following morning, Willowbrook awoke under a sky of soft gray, clouds drifting lazily as though unsure whether to release rain or remain a solemn canopy over the village, a fitting reflection of the uncertainty that now gripped its inhabitants. Miss Marple, having risen with the sun, prepared herself for a day of quiet observation, aware that the arrival of the funeral invitation was already stirring undercurrents among the villagers that would take days to reveal fully. She set out for her customary stroll along the village lanes, noting with keen eyes the subtle alterations in daily routines, shopkeepers lingering at the doorways, as if gauging the intentions of passers-by, children whispering behind hedges, their eyes wide with speculation, and the elderly, walking with measured steps, exchanging nods and half-smiles that hinted at knowledge they were unwilling or afraid to share. Even the dogs seemed subdued, their usual barking replaced by cautious sniffing at the edges of paths and gardens, as if the animals themselves sensed the tension in the air. As she approached the corner where the tea-room stood, the faint aroma of freshly baked scones mingled with the crisp morning air, but beneath the sweetness, Miss Marple detected a lingering undercurrent of unease. Inside, Mrs. Pennington was already ensconced in her favorite seat, whispering to a small cluster of women about the mysterious letter, her hands fluttering as she described its weight, its wax seal, and the forbidding tone of the message. "It's not merely a funeral notice," she murmured, leaning forward. "Something about it. It feels like a summons for more than mourning. I cannot explain it, but it chills the heart." Mrs. Finch, sitting opposite, nodded vigorously, her cheeks rosy yet anxious. "And to think we know no name, no indication of who has passed." One cannot help but wonder if it is an Ashcroft at the center of some hidden trouble, a secret long buried that is now being brought into the open. Miss Marple, listening with a quiet, unobtrusive patience, sipped her tea and let her mind weave observations into a tapestry of potentialities. The reactions of these women, the slight tension in their voices, and the way they avoided direct eye contact with others in the room all spoke volumes about the anticipation and fear the letter had generated. She noted that while gossip often distorted facts, it also revealed human motives, insecurities, and inclinations that could not remain entirely concealed. Leaving the tea rooms, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the post office, where the morning's mail had already arrived and was being sorted by the postmistress. She observed how the letters, parcels, and notices seemed mundane on their surface, yet carried within them patterns, anomalies, and subtle cues, thicker envelopes suggesting formality, foreign stamps hinting at distant correspondence, and handwriting that betrayed urgency, carelessness, or secrecy. Each piece of mail was a potential clue, a fragment of the larger puzzle surrounding the Ashcroft family and the implications of the funeral invitation. Villagers passed along the lanes, some pausing to exchange comments about the letter, others merely glancing with curiosity or veiled concern. Mr. Whitford, the local innkeeper, stood at his doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth, and engaged in low conversation with Mr. Pierce, the shoemaker, both speculating about the Ashcrofts' intentions and the purpose behind the letter's formal tone. Miss Marple observed them closely. The slight narrowing of eyes, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to another, the brief pauses before speech, all minor gestures revealing thought, hesitation, and perhaps hidden apprehension. By mid-morning, news of the funeral invitation had reached nearly every household, carried in whispers, careful glances, and hushed speculations. Even those who had no direct connection to the Ashcroft family felt compelled to form opinions, conjecture motives, and imagine scenarios that ranged from the mundane to the ominous. Miss Marple recognized the inevitable escalation that would follow, stories amplified, details distorted, and tension accumulating as the days toward the funeral passed. She moved on to the village green, where early risers gathered to exchange observations about crops, weather, and the more pressing topic of the day, the enigmatic letter. She noted how gestures betrayed emotion. Mrs. Larkins fidgeted with her apron, Mr. Collins's jaw tensed as he listened, and a group of young men whispered conspiratorially while attempting to appear nonchalant. Every movement, every pause, every inflection held meaning, and Miss Marple catalogued it all, mentally constructing the relationships, rivalries, and concealed fears that might influence behavior when the manor doors opened to receive its visitors. Turning toward Ashcroft Manor, she considered its looming presence, the way the stone walls cast shadows over the gardens, and the stillness that seemed almost unnatural. The house itself was an actor in the unfolding drama, its corridors and rooms holding echoes of past events, memories of disputes, and remnants of grief and joy alike. She reflected on the subtle cues that a house could convey, a window slightly ajar revealing urgency, a footstep on the stair that paused too long, a curtain that swayed in an unusual manner. Each of these small signals might inform her understanding of the household's inner workings. By noon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage to review her mental notes. She considered the sequence of events that had already transpired, the letter's arrival, the villagers' responses, the subtle tensions in shops and tea rooms, and the unmistakable atmosphere of expectation that had settled over Willowbrook. Each observation was a piece of the puzzle, a small yet significant fragment of a broader story she was beginning to see take shape. The afternoon passed quietly, though not without subtle observations. She noticed a new gardener working at the Ashcroft estate, adjusting plants and trimming hedges with precision that suggested more than routine care. The caretaker, an elderly man with a stooped back, moved about the grounds with a measured, almost secretive pace. Miss Marple made note of these movements, knowing that human interactions, even those seemingly mundane, could reveal much about tensions, intentions, and potential conflicts. Evening approached, bringing with it a soft haze over the village, the sky now painted in muted tones of amber and gray. Street lamps flickered to life, casting pools of golden light onto the cobblestones, highlighting the quiet urgency of footsteps, the subtle exchanges of glances, and the occasional hush that fell over groups of villagers conversing in low voices. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple prepared her tea, her mind still active, reviewing every detail of the day, conversations overheard, gestures observed, and patterns emerging that could, in time, lead her to the heart of the unfolding mystery. She considered the letter once more, not as a mere notification of a funeral, but as a catalyst that would draw to the surface motives, secrets, and hidden alliances. Her notebook, though modest in appearance, contained an ever-growing record of impressions, each entry a potential key to understanding the interplay between the Ashcroft family, their servants, the villagers, and the intangible currents of human emotion. By nightfall, Willowbrook had settled under a blanket of mist and quiet anticipation. The distant outline of Ashcroft Manor loomed like a silent sentinel, its windows reflecting the faint glow of moonlight and candlelight from within. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair, the notebook open before her, the letter carefully placed nearby, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She understood fully that the invitation was only the beginning. The events it set in motion would test the judgment, patience, and intelligence of all involved. In the days to come, the villagers' fears, hopes, and concealed intentions would collide, revealing both the darkness and resilience inherent in human nature. Miss Marple, calm and perceptive as ever, felt a quiet anticipation. She would observe, record, and, in time, understand. The true mystery, she knew, lay not merely in the funeral itself, but in the intricate web of relationships, past grievances, and concealed motives that would unfold as the story progressed. And so, as the village lights dimmed and Willowbrook succumbed to the hush of night, Miss Marple's mind worked tirelessly, connecting threads, noting anomalies, and preparing for the revelations that would inevitably follow, aware that patience, observation, and quiet intelligence were the keys to uncovering the truth behind the funeral invitation and whatever secrets Ashcroft Manor and its inhabitants might hold. Chapter 4. The Arrival at Ashcroft Manor. The day of the funeral invitation summons dawned over Willowbrook with a pale, diffused sunlight that did little to warm the chill lingering in the air, and Miss Marple, as ever, rose early, her mind already alert to the subtleties that would reveal themselves over the hours to come. She prepared a modest breakfast, noting the faint rustle of birds in her garden and the distant clatter of carts on cobblestone lanes, each ordinary sound underscored now with an unusual tension, a premonition of the events awaiting at Ashcroft Manor. As she dressed, she reflected on the sequence of impressions she had gathered since the arrival of the mysterious letter, the hushed speculations of villagers, the subtle gestures and postures that hinted at concealed anxieties, and the quiet observations she had recorded regarding the manor itself, its imposing facade, the careful arrangement of its gardens, and the shadows that clung to its corners like silent watchers. By mid-morning, she set out on the familiar lane toward the manor, noting with precision the village's current state, shopkeepers exchanging nervous glances, the postmistress pausing in her sorting, and children running past with whispered excitement, aware that a day of significance was about to unfold. The path leading to Ashcroft Manor climbed steadily, lined with hedgerows beginning to bloom with early spring flowers, their colors muted by the morning haze. Miss Marple's keen eye noted each detail, from the footprints left in damp earth to the slight disturbances in gravel that suggested recent movement, perhaps of staff preparing for visitors, perhaps of unknown visitors arriving ahead of the appointed hour. As she approached the grand wrought-iron gates, she observed a figure moving across the front lawn, the caretaker adjusting the boundary of flower beds with meticulous care, and a gardener tending to overgrown hedges. Even in these mundane acts, Miss Marple saw significance. The precision of movement, the slight tension in shoulders, the occasional glance toward the manor house that suggested awareness beyond simple routine tasks. The manor itself loomed ahead, a vast stone structure with high windows catching the pale sunlight and reflecting it in dull, solemn glimmers. Curtains twitched briefly as they were adjusted by unseen hands, and a faint sound of voices, muted and careful, rose from within. Miss Marple noted it all with quiet appreciation, recognizing the prelude to the arrival of guests and the potential for tensions to surface once human interactions began in earnest. Entering through the side pathway, she reached the front entrance just as a small procession of villagers began to arrive, each carrying a combination of curiosity, trepidation, and the faintly performative civility that comes when one is unsure of what to expect. The manor doors, tall and imposing, were opened by a butler whose expression remained neutral yet who cast subtle glances toward Miss Marple, as if acknowledging her presence and her quiet acuity. Guests exchanged polite greetings, though their eyes betrayed concern, speculation, or, in some cases, thinly veiled excitement. Miss Marple observed every detail, the handshake offered too firmly, the pause before a bow, the tilt of a head that suggested pretense, and the soft whispers shared in fleeting moments out of earshot. Each movement was a fragment of information, each hesitation a clue to motive, and each small gesture a potential revelation. The atmosphere within Ashcroft Manor was carefully controlled, Yet Miss Marple noted a tension beneath the surface. She walked slowly along the corridor, her steps soft on the polished floorboards, her attention absorbing the subtle creaks, the shifting of heavy curtains, and the muted reflections of sunlight on glass and wood. The air smelled faintly of polished wood, wax, and the lingering fragrance of fresh flowers, an attempt at decorum that masked, rather than diminished, the anxiety simmering within. Conversations began in low tones, polite yet laced with curiosity, as relatives, neighbors, and a handful of invited villagers exchanged observations about the funeral, the mysterious nature of the letter, and speculations about who might have died and why the invitation had been worded so deliberately. Miss Marple did not engage immediately in conversation. Instead, she stood quietly, noting patterns of speech, timing of responses, and subtle physical cues, the tightening of hands around teacups, the fleeting glance toward the manor's upper windows, the way some participants positioned themselves in proximity to others to assert dominance or display allegiance. Even in these delicate movements, Miss Marple perceived undercurrents of tension and concealed emotion, knowing that when the full events unfolded, these seemingly minor observations would illuminate the truth far more clearly than any overt statements could. Afternoon passed slowly within the manor, each hour filled with murmured commentary, measured gestures, and the quiet watchfulness of the staff who moved about with professional precision, their eyes often flicking toward the guests to note reactions or anticipate needs. Miss Marple, moving discreetly among the crowd, catalogued these interactions meticulously, her mind connecting threads of behavior to past observations. The brief hesitation of a hand when adjusting a sleeve, the sharp intake of breath at an unexpected comment, or the careful avoidance of direct eye contact during conversation. By early evening, the gathering had reached a crescendo of subdued anticipation. Guests had been shown to their rooms or drawn into small parlors for tea, and Miss Marple, having observed and recorded, finally allowed herself a measured cup, her mind reviewing the intricate patterns she had witnessed. The manor, seemingly inert and silent, had in reality become a stage on which human dramas played out with subtle gestures, unspoken warnings, and veiled intentions. And through it all, Miss Marple remained the observer, the quiet intelligence amidst a swirl of curiosity, emotion, and speculation, aware that the funeral invitation was but the first note in a symphony of events that would reveal the manifold secrets, grievances, and hidden truths of Ashcroft Manor. As twilight fell and the first lamps were lit within the hallways, casting warm pools of light upon the polished floors and heavy curtains, Miss Marple retreated to a quiet corner to reflect. The details of the day, the guests' interactions, the minute adjustments of posture, the occasional slip of expression, formed a complex pattern that she would need to decipher with care. For now, she allowed herself a moment of calm, appreciating the silent signals of the manor, the subtle whispers of tension in conversation, and the knowledge that patience, careful observation, and the insight born of experience would ultimately reveal the true nature of the mystery concealed within the walls of Ashcroft Manor and the enigma of the funeral invitation that had drawn Willowbrook's inhabitants to this day. The shadows lengthened across corridors, and the manor seemed to breathe in quiet anticipation, as if aware that its secrets would not remain hidden for long. Miss Marple, serene yet ever vigilant, sipped her tea slowly, recording mental notes, and felt the familiar quiet thrill of anticipation as the first pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Chapter 5: Secrets Behind Closed Doors. As the morning sun climbed slowly over Willowbrook, casting gentle light upon the manicured hedges and cobblestone paths of Ashcroft Manor, Miss Marple awoke early, her mind restless with reflections on the day before, for the arrival of the funeral invitation had already set in motion currents of curiosity, speculation, and subtle tension that flowed unseen through the villagers and the household alike. She dressed methodically, her movements calm and deliberate, noticing the way the faint breeze rustled the curtains and how the scent of polished wood and lingering floral arrangements mingled in the air, a reminder of the care and attention lavished on appearances even amidst the uncertainty that loomed. As she descended the grand staircase and passed through the corridor leading to the drawing-room, she took note of the small details that others might overlook, the way a carpet edge curled slightly, suggesting recent movement, the careful placement of chairs as if to control the flow of conversation, the faint echoes of voices from the upper floors where servants moved with unobtrusive precision, carrying out tasks with an almost imperceptible tension that spoke of knowledge withheld and emotions carefully constrained. Guests were beginning to stir in the manor's expansive rooms, some greeting one another with polite nods and reserved smiles, others murmuring under their breath, speculating about the cryptic nature of the invitation and the purpose behind the gathering. Miss Marple observed, with her accustomed patience, the nuanced interplay of these social cues, the way a hand lingered slightly too long on a teacup, the careful avoidance of direct gaze, the faint shift of weight from foot to foot when Uncertainty or curiosity prompted subtle discomfort. Every gesture, every whispered comment, was a piece of the puzzle she was piecing together in her mind. By mid-morning, the drawing room had filled with a quiet hum of conversation, punctuated occasionally by nervous laughter, coughs, and the faint scrape of furniture as someone adjusted their position. Miss Marple, seated in a corner where she could observe without being intrusive, took mental note of each movement, each hesitation, each exchange, knowing that human behavior, even in its smallest manifestations, revealed much more than words could ever convey. She noticed the Ashcroft family. Members moving with careful attention, maintaining appearances of composure, yet betraying subtle signs of anxiety, the slight tremor in a hand, the soft sigh as a memory flickered across their minds, the fleeting glance toward the grand windows as if measuring who else might be watching. Outside, the garden offered a different kind of observation, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to wander briefly among the trimmed hedges and flower beds, noting the deliberate arrangement of plants, the faint disturbances in soil suggesting recent digging, and the unusual positioning of garden furniture. Each of these details, innocuous as they might seem, formed part of the larger tapestry of the household's hidden narrative, a silent testimony to events that had occurred, were occurring, or were yet to be revealed. Within the manor, servants moved silently, their presence almost imperceptible but their influence undeniable. Miss Marple took note of their glances, the way they responded to guests, the fleeting expressions of concern or recognition that passed between them, and the moments when they whispered behind closed doors. These subtle cues, she knew, often contained the seeds of truth, revealing alliances, grievances, and fears that were otherwise carefully concealed. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple observed a growing tension among the guests. Some appeared to compete for attention, others to assert dominance, and a few seemed determined to remain inconspicuous, each strategy revealing personality and potential motives in microcosm. She noted the conversations that meandered, the pauses pregnant with meaning, and the quiet reactions to seemingly trivial remarks, understanding that every gesture and every word had significance in the intricate social web of Willowbrook. The kitchen, though bustling with activity, offered its own secrets. The smell of baked bread and simmering stew filled the air, masking, but not concealing, the whispered exchanges between the staff, who moved with practiced precision yet occasionally exchanged glances that hinted at knowledge beyond their official duties. Miss Marple observed this too, noting the subtle ways in which service, observation, and secrecy intertwined, creating a network of information that only a careful observer could fully decipher. By afternoon, the manor had taken on the feel of a stage set for revelation. Guests moved from room to room, drawn to conversations or activities that promised insight into the nature of the gathering, yet always under the watchful eye of the household, which maintained its composure even as anxiety rippled subtly through the air. Miss Marple, ever patient, recorded each interaction mentally, the nod of recognition, the fleeting look of suspicion, the small acts of kindness or cruelty, all integral pieces of the story she was beginning to unravel. A sudden noise from the upper floor, a door closing more sharply than usual, caused a brief ripple among the guests. Some looked toward the sound with curiosity, others feigned indifference, yet Miss Marple noticed the faint tension it caused, the way it disrupted the rhythm of conversation, and how it hinted at underlying conflicts yet to surface. She knew that such small disturbances often presaged more significant events, revealing cracks in the carefully constructed facade of propriety that the Ashcroft family maintained. As evening approached, the manor took on a softer glow, candles flickering in their sconces, casting gentle light upon the polished wood and walls lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow the living with silent scrutiny. Miss Marple, seated once again in her corner, contemplated the intricate dance of human behavior she had witnessed, recognizing patterns, noting anomalies, and mentally arranging the puzzle pieces that would, in time, allow her to see the full picture. Conversations continued, now tinged with fatigue and the quiet edge of anticipation. Guests exchanged subtle signals, observed one another with renewed attention, and sought to glean information through indirect remarks, all unaware of the depth of observation taking place in the quiet figure of Miss Marple. By nightfall, as the manor settled under a mantle of calm, broken only by occasional creaks of floorboards and the soft rustle of curtains, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events, the seemingly inconsequential details that in truth spoke volumes. A misplaced book, a hastily adjusted chair, the faint aroma of a room recently vacated, the lingering echoes of words spoken in passing. She understood that the funeral invitation was more than a notice. It was a catalyst, bringing to the surface buried tensions, hidden rivalries, and secrets long kept, each waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Miss Marple, serene and patient, allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that her careful observations, her attentiveness to nuance, and her understanding of human nature were already positioning her to unravel the enigma of Ashcroft Manor, its inhabitants, and the mystery surrounding the funeral invitation. Chapter 6. The Hidden Correspondence. Morning arrived at Ashcroft Manor with a delicate mist drifting over the grounds, softening the edges of hedges and flower beds and casting a quiet hush over Willowbrook, yet within the house itself, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Miss Marple, awake before dawn, had already reviewed in her mind the sequence of events from the previous day, the subtle gestures of the guests, the whispered comments behind closed doors, the minor disturbances that had caught her attention but seemed invisible to others, and she felt a growing certainty that something concealed was waiting to emerge, something more intricate than the outward politeness and restrained conversation could reveal. She dressed with care, her movements deliberate, the gentle rustle of her clothing mingling with the soft tick of a distant clock, each sound a quiet punctuation in the stillness of the early hours. Crossing the corridor to the drawing-room, she noted the placement of furniture, the slight dust disturbances on surfaces that indicated recent movement, and the subtle shifts in the tapestry and curtains, all of which, in their quiet manner, suggested preparation for the day's unfolding events. The manor, she thought, was alive with unspoken tensions, each room a canvas upon which private anxieties and hidden motives painted their subtle patterns, and her keen observation would allow her to decipher them when the time came. Guests began to trickle into the morning salon, their faces composed but their eyes betraying curiosity and unease, for the funeral invitation had sown more than simple expectation. It had planted seeds of intrigue, speculation, and latent conflict. Miss Marple watched as a gentleman adjusted his waistcoat with slightly trembling fingers, a young woman shifted nervously in her chair, and the household staff moved with careful synchronization, all performing their roles with precision yet leaving faint traces of personal sentiment that a keen observer could perceive. Conversation opened cautiously, polite remarks exchanged about the weather, the condition of roads, and the lingering chill of early spring, yet under the veneer of civility, each speaker carefully measured their words, aware that the manor and its current guests formed a stage where missteps might betray more than intended. Miss Marple, sipping a small cup of tea, noted the pauses, the micro-expressions, the fleeting glances that accompanied statements, and she catalogued each in her mind, understanding that patterns of speech and body language would reveal truths unspoken. A soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of a letter, delivered by the butler with discreet care. Its envelope was plain, marked only with elegant handwriting, and it was passed to Miss Marple, who recognized at once the subtle significance of its presentation, the deliberate timing, the secrecy, and the expectation that it might provoke curiosity or unease. She held it briefly, noting the weight, the texture of the paper, the scent of ink, and the carefully folded edges, each detail suggesting intentionality and potential importance. Carefully breaking the seal, she read the contents with calm attention. A brief, formal note, hinting at matters previously unmentioned, referencing an earlier correspondence, and alluding to a discovery to be made within the manor. The words themselves were innocuous, yet the context, the phrasing, and the deliberate subtlety conveyed a message intended for attentive eyes only, a message that promised revelation for those capable of understanding its nuances. As she reread the letter, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift around the room, noting the reactions of those present, though she made no outward display of interest. She saw slight twitches of curiosity, the discreet shifting of eyes toward her, and the subtle tension that passed through the assembly, an unconscious acknowledgment that a development had occurred, though none could articulate it aloud. Miss Marple set the letter aside and began to move through the rooms of Ashcroft Manor with measured steps, her mind analyzing every detail, the placement of furniture, the slight irregularities in carpeting, the minute adjustments of curtains and cushions, and the faint traces of footprints or disturbances that suggested prior movements, conversations, or the concealment of objects. Each observation, though seemingly trivial to the casual eye, formed part of a complex web that she was quietly unraveling. She paused before a small writing desk, noting the faint indentations on the surface of paper left by a pen recently lifted, the subtle discoloration of the wood beneath the palms of hands, and the carefully arranged stacks of letters that suggested deliberate concealment or retrieval. Her experience in human behavior told her that the objects themselves were secondary to the intentions behind them, that the true story lay in the why and how, not merely the what. Afternoon brought a series of visits from the various guests to the salon and library, their conversations weaving a delicate tapestry of observation, conjecture, and subtle social maneuvering. Miss Marple, maintaining her unobtrusive presence, catalogued each statement, each expression, each fleeting gesture that betrayed tension, concern, or excitement. She observed rivalries manifest in careful word choices, alliances hinted at by shared glances, and minor conflicts revealed in small adjustments of posture or avoidance of eye contact. In the library, she found evidence of further correspondence, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, marked by handwriting differing in style, pressure, and ink tone. Some letters were deliberately formal, others contained personal flourishes that betrayed familiarity and emotional undertone. Miss Marple, with her customary patience, examined each in sequence, noting discrepancies, peculiarities, and connections that others would consider irrelevant, yet she recognized them as vital. Clues in understanding the unfolding narrative of Ashcroft Manor, the funeral invitation, and the layers of secrecy enveloping its inhabitants. The day's observations extended to subtle interactions in corridors, glimpses through windows, and the quiet yet deliberate movements of staff members whose loyalty, discretion, or anxiety were revealed in micro-expressions and fleeting behaviors. Miss Marple catalogued all with meticulous care, forming an internal map of relationships, tensions, and possible motives, aware that the culmination of these observations would lead to revelation. As evening descended, the manor took on a subdued glow, candles flickering, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, reflecting the complexity of human emotion that Miss Marple had witnessed throughout the day. The house seemed almost sentient, absorbing the fears, curiosities, and secret desires of those within it, while she, calm and vigilant, sat in quiet reflection, tracing each nuance, each subtle signal, and each hidden meaning in her mind. By nightfall, she had reconstructed much of the day's narrative, observing how guests interacted with objects, letters, and each other, noting the implications of gestures, silences, and fleeting looks. She recognized that the funeral invitation was more than a summons. It was a catalyst, designed to uncover truths, provoke reflection, and test the readiness of Ashcroft Manor's occupants to reveal their hidden selves. Miss Marple, serene yet intensely attentive, recorded mental notes on each revelation. Chapter 7: Shadows in the Drawing Room. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of Ashcroft Manor, illuminating the drawing room in gentle, golden hues, yet despite the apparent serenity, an undercurrent of unease threaded through the air, palpable in the subtle stiffness of the guests' postures, the slight hesitations in their speech, and the occasional, involuntary glance cast toward closed doors or shadowed corners. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in her usual corner, observed with quiet patience, noting the interplay of light and shadow not only across the room but across the faces and gestures of those present, understanding the human behavior, in its smallest tremors and pauses, often revealed far more than words. As she sipped her tea, its warmth grounding her amidst the subtle tension, she catalogued every micro-expression, the carefully measured nods, the fleeting pursing of lips, and the faint clenching of hands that betrayed the inner agitation of the otherwise composed individuals. The drawing-room itself, meticulously arranged with velvet drapes, polished wood, and carefully curated ornaments, seemed to hold its breath, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock punctuating the otherwise hushed atmosphere, each chime marking the passage of time in which secrets simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for the precise moment to emerge. Miss Marple, with her practiced eye, perceived the way the placement of furniture subtly directed movement and conversation, how the positioning of chairs offered observation points or concealed interactions, and how the slightest shift of an object could reveal intentionality or concealment, all of which contributed to the intricate social tapestry she quietly unraveled in her mind. As the morning wore on, conversations began in measured tones, polite inquiries about weather, travel, or health serving as the veneer for deeper, unspoken currents of curiosity and tension. Some guests spoke with careful confidence, projecting calm while masking apprehension, while others remained restrained, their silence speaking volumes to the discerning observer. Miss Marple noted how each individual navigated the complex web of social interaction, the strategies employed to protect secrets or probe for information, and the subtle alliances and rivalries revealed in glances, gestures, and timing. A soft rustle of paper drew her attention, a letter, left discreetly on a side table, its presence deliberate yet designed to appear casual. Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward it, recognizing the importance of such a seemingly innocuous object, for she understood that communication, both overt and hidden, often carried the weight of intention, misdirection, and revelation. She made a mental note to examine its contents later, aware that the nuances of phrasing, the choice of envelope, and the positioning within the room could all provide insight into the underlying motives of its sender. Footsteps echoed lightly along the polished floors as household staff moved with precise efficiency, their presence almost invisible yet undeniably influential in shaping the dynamics of the morning. Miss Marple observed the subtle interactions between servants and guests, the brief exchanges of glances, the tiny adjustments of posture, the whispered communications, that revealed more than mere service, hinting at loyalties, discreet knowledge, and unspoken understandings carefully maintained. Within the hierarchical structure of the manor. In one corner, a pair of guests conversed in hushed tones, their voices low, yet Miss Marple detected in their cadence and choice of words the presence of hidden tension, unresolved conflicts, and concealed agendas. She traced the movement of their eyes, the slight inflections in their speech, and the fleeting reactions to surrounding stimuli, weaving these observations into the complex mental map she maintained of relationships, possible motives, and potential triggers for the unfolding drama. The fireplace crackled gently, sending warmth across the polished floorboards and adding a soft, comforting background to the otherwise taut atmosphere. Miss Marple noted the way shadows danced across the walls, sometimes obscuring, sometimes revealing, in a visual metaphor for the duality of appearance and reality that she constantly observed in human behavior. She recognized that each shadow, each subtle movement of light, could influence perception, conceal intent, or highlight inadvertent clues in the delicate balance of the manor's social interactions. A sudden cough, delicate yet pointed, broke the flow of conversation in the room, prompting a ripple of attention that revealed the sensitivity of those present to even the smallest disruptions. Miss Marple, attuned to these micro-events, observed the subtle reactions, the soft tightening of a jaw, the imperceptible shift of weight, the momentary narrowing of eyes, and interpreted them as indicators of internal states, hidden knowledge, and the tentative balance of trust and suspicion maintained among the attendees. As the morning progressed toward midday, Miss Marple moved quietly to a side table, lifting the letter she had earlier noticed, examining it with careful attention to its physical characteristics, the texture of the paper, the style of handwriting, the choice of words, the folding pattern, and even the faint scent embedded in the ink. Each detail, she understood, was a potential clue, a reflection of the sender's personality, intent, and possible involvement in the manifold secrets woven throughout Ashcroft Manor. The manor itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, the echo of footsteps, the soft creak of doors, and the muted conversation forming a subtle symphony of tension that underscored the unfolding narrative. Miss Marple observed the rhythm of these sounds, the timing of movements, and the interaction between spatial arrangement and human behavior, perceiving patterns that would elude any less attentive observer. Outside, the garden lay bathed in soft sunlight, shadows of trees stretching across the neatly trimmed hedges, yet even here, subtle signs of disturbance, a slightly shifted stone, a trampled flower bed, a faint trace of footprints, hinted at secret movement, clandestine activities, and perhaps the hidden presence of a visitor or intruder. Miss Marple, peering briefly through the tall windows, catalogued these observations alongside the more overt interactions within the drawing room, integrating them into her growing understanding of the unfolding mystery. By late afternoon, tensions in the drawing room had shifted imperceptibly, the polite exchanges giving way to more pointed conversation, a subtle probing for information, and a careful testing of reactions. Miss Marple observed each nuanced response, the flicker of the eyes, the pause before answering, the slight change in tone, as invaluable insight into the fears, ambitions, and secrets harbored by those present, each fragment contributing to the emerging picture of the Ashcroft family, the guests, and the implications of the funeral invitation that had drawn them together. Evening approached, the warm glow of sunset filtering through the windows and casting elongated shadows across the polished floors, emphasizing the contrast between light and dark, appearance and reality, concealment and revelation. Miss Marple, sitting with quiet composure, reflected on the day's events, on the layered interactions she had observed, and on the subtle threads connecting behavior. Chapter 8: Secrets Among the Servants. The day unfolded with a quiet tension that seemed to seep into every corner of Ashcroft Manor, a tension amplified not only by the lingering presence of the funeral invitation, but also by the subtle interactions between guests and household staff, for Miss Marple, with her keen eye for observation, understood that secrets often moved quietly through those who went unnoticed, the silent carriers of knowledge hidden behind measured smiles and dutiful service. The kitchen, the corridors, and the servant quarters held their own narrative, one of whispered conversations, cautious glances, and the careful exchange of information that could illuminate motives and concealments invisible to the casual observer, and Miss Marple, attentive to every sound, step, and pause, traced the invisible lines connecting actions to intentions, gestures to secrets, and movements to knowledge. She had noticed earlier the subtle hesitations in the butler's walk, the soft clinking of utensils timed almost deliberately as he moved from room to room, the slight lifting of eyes toward a closed door, and she catalogued each gesture with the same care she applied to conversations among the guests. In her mind, these seemingly trivial details formed a complex network of connections, each node revealing insight into loyalties, suspicions, and concealed truths that might never be spoken aloud. The housemaid, young and nervous, appeared particularly on edge, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the silverware for afternoon tea, glancing at the drawing-room with fleeting curiosity before looking away, and Miss Marple observed the subtle cues, the quickening of her pulse as perceived in posture, the almost imperceptible shift of weight, and the fleeting glance toward the library, all suggesting that knowledge or events existed beyond the reach of casual understanding, that something had occurred or was anticipated, and that this individual might unknowingly hold a piece of the larger puzzle surrounding the funeral invitation and the mysterious undercurrents of Ashcroft Manor. Conversations among the staff were as layered and coded as those among the guests, consisting of polite inquiries, seemingly mundane instructions, and casual remarks that masked awareness of tensions, knowledge of minor disputes, and awareness of interpersonal dynamics. Miss Marple, always discreet, listened attentively to the cadence, timing, and selection of words, noting how certain phrases or careful avoidance of topics indicated a deliberate maintenance of secrecy, a strategy to navigate the delicate social hierarchy of the manor and the hidden anxieties of its occupants. Throughout the day, she traced movements within corridors, noting where doors had been closed too quickly, where shadows hinted at unseen presences, and where slight disturbances in dust or carpeting betrayed prior passage. Each observation added a fragment to the growing mental map of relationships, opportunities, and concealed interactions, and she knew that even the smallest detail could provide a key insight into the broader mystery, revealing motives, connections, and potential triggers for the hidden tensions that pervaded the household. In the afternoon, Miss Marple paused near the back stairwell to observe the interaction between the cook and the housekeeper, their conversation appearing casual yet underlined by fleeting glances, subtle shifts of posture, and the occasional lowered voice. She interpreted these gestures as part of the unspoken communication between those who knew more than they were permitted to disclose, and she considered how these insights could later illuminate connections between seemingly unrelated events, particularly in relation to the enigmatic funeral invitation and the quiet apprehension it had inspired among both guests and staff. The drawing-room, meanwhile, remained a stage where the subtle intricacies of social behavior played out, conversations layered with polite masking of curiosity, glances that hinted at concern or awareness, and the careful timing of speech that revealed underlying alliances or rivalries. Miss Marple, from her unassuming corner, recorded these behavioral subtleties with meticulous care, understanding that human behavior often communicated more than words ever could, and that the careful weaving together of these observations would ultimately illuminate the hidden motives, fears, and secrets held within the walls of Ashcroft Manor. Shadows cast by late afternoon sunlight accentuated the expressions, gestures, and postures of guests and staff alike, emphasizing the duality of appearance and reality, concealment and revelation, and Miss Marple, attuned to these subtleties, traced the interplay of light and shadow across faces and rooms, recognizing how physical positioning, timing, and environmental cues could influence perception, conceal intent, and reveal inadvertent truths. A sudden, muted clatter from the upper hallway, a tray dropped, a door left slightly ajar, drew the attention of a few guests, but Miss Marple, noting the absence of alarm in some faces and the tension in others, understood that such minor disturbances were often laden with significance, revealing reactions and relationships, testifying to the knowledge or ignorance of those involved, and she catalogued these micro-events as part of her ongoing investigation into the undercurrents shaping the day's unfolding drama. By evening, the manor had settled into a rhythm of quiet observation, with staff attending to their duties and guests navigating the subtle dance of conversation, propriety, and hidden curiosity. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, reflected on the accumulation of minor incidents, the brief exchanges in corridors, the careful adjustments of objects, the subtle hesitation of voices, the fleeting facial expressions, and wove them together into a coherent mental narrative that accounted for human behavior, opportunity, and the delicate interplay of secrets within the household. She considered the way the funeral invitation had acted as a catalyst, bringing to the fore latent anxieties, unspoken tensions, and the subtle revelation of character traits under pressure. The guest's composure, though outwardly perfect, was now interlaced with caution, curiosity, and a measure of suspicion, and she observed how the staff's awareness of these dynamics added a further layer of complexity, their discreet actions and careful conversations serving as both shield and informant for the unfolding mystery. In the quiet of the evening, Miss Marple took stock of the day's observations, noting how patterns had begun to emerge, which individuals appeared burdened with secret knowledge, which gestures betrayed internal conflict, and which seemingly minor events might prove crucial in unraveling the broader narrative of Ashcroft Manor and its enigmatic funeral invitation. She understood that patience, attention, and calm observation were her greatest assets, that truth often revealed itself gradually, through behavior rather than words, and that the subtleties she had witnessed among both guests and servants would, in time, coalesce into a complete understanding of the hidden motives. Chapter 9. The Hidden Letter. Late in the morning, as the soft haze of dawn lightened into a clearer day, Miss Marple sat quietly in the far corner of the Ashcroft Manor library, her gaze skimming over the rows of books with the casual air of a reader yet the meticulous attention of a detective, noting not only the titles and arrangement of the volumes but also the subtle disturbances in the dust on the shelves, the slight misalignment of bindings, and the faint impressions on the wooden desk that suggested something, or someone, had been moved or handled with deliberate care, for she knew that in a house such as this, secrets often left their traces not in words but in small, almost imperceptible details, and she catalogued each with her mind's quiet precision, recognizing patterns in the placement of objects, the folding of papers, and the slight discoloration of surfaces that might otherwise escape notice. She observed the behavior of the staff as they moved silently through the corridors, the faint creak of a floorboard revealing the passage of a maid, the measured steps of the butler hinting at the careful management of both time and information, and she reflected on the way each individual navigated the complex network of relationships, loyalties, and secrets that the funeral invitation had drawn into focus, understanding that observation required patience, discernment, and an unwavering attention to the human element that pervaded every action and inaction within the manor. A letter lay upon the desk before her, its envelope marked with a seal that suggested both formality and caution, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered upon it, discerning the subtle pressure of the seal, the faint indentation of handwriting, and the choice of paper, all of which spoke to the sender's intent, their desire for discretion, and the possible significance of the correspondence in the broader mystery that had taken root within Ashcroft Manor. She carefully turned the envelope over, noting the faint traces of fingerprints and the subtle discoloration around the edges, cataloguing these details with the same meticulous care she applied to observing people, for in her experience, physical evidence and human behavior were often intertwined, each illuminating the other. The guests had begun to gather in the drawing-room, their conversation polite yet layered with unspoken concerns, and Miss Marple observed from her vantage point how the subtle gestures, measured pauses, and fleeting glances revealed more than the words themselves, demonstrating the interplay of fear, curiosity, and concealed knowledge, the invisible tensions woven into every interaction. She noted how each person positioned themselves relative to others, how they managed eye contact, and how their body language betrayed both confidence and apprehension, recognizing that these minute details, when considered alongside the presence of the mysterious letter, could provide crucial insight into motives, secrets, and potential conflicts. The day's rhythm carried on with an almost deliberate sense of normality, yet beneath this veneer, Miss Marple discerned the pulse of anxiety, suspicion, and concealed history that had begun to thread through every interaction, from the cautious conversations between guests to the furtive exchanges among staff, and she recognized the delicate balance maintained in this environment, where appearances were preserved while underlying truths lingered, waiting for the precise moment to surface. She catalogued these dynamics, noting how the funeral invitation had acted as both catalyst and mirror, revealing latent fears, ambitions, and tensions, and how the hidden letter might further illuminate the connections and rivalries concealed within the manor's social fabric. A sudden movement at the far end of the library caught her attention. A shadow flickered across the wall, subtle yet deliberate, and Miss Marple's eyes followed the path of the motion, recognizing the significance of timing, positioning, and intent, understanding that even the smallest action could serve as a clue, a deliberate misdirection, or a reflection of concealed knowledge. She noted how the shadow aligned with certain furnishings, how the shift in light revealed or obscured surfaces, and how the interplay of illumination and concealment mirrored the psychological and social dynamics she had been quietly tracing throughout the morning. She lifted the letter, breaking the seal with careful precision, and examined its contents, reading each word slowly, discerning not only the message itself but also the subtleties of phrasing, emphasis, and omission, for Miss Marple knew that written communication often concealed as much as it revealed, its meanings layered beneath carefully chosen words, deliberate pauses, and stylistic flourishes, each element potentially indicative of personality, intent, and the broader network of relationships and secrets within the household. She catalogued these details with the same care and patience applied to her observations of human behavior, recognizing that letters, like gestures, expressions, and minor disturbances in the environment, formed part of a larger, interconnected puzzle. Outside, the manor grounds were bathed in the gentle warmth of late morning sun, shadows stretching along the paths and lawns, yet Miss Marple's attention remained on the intricate interactions inside, understanding that the outward calm of the garden, the orderly flower beds, and the neatly trimmed hedges contrasted sharply with the currents of anxiety, curiosity, and hidden knowledge flowing through the rooms of the house. And she noted that the spatial and temporal relationships between these elements, inside and outside, observed and concealed, could provide insight into movement, opportunity, and the alignment of events that might otherwise appear coincidental. Conversations among guests continued, polite inquiries intertwined with subtle probing, yet Miss Marple noticed the careful calibration of each statement, the layered meanings behind seemingly innocuous remarks, and the fleeting micro-expressions that betrayed concern, surprise, or recognition, and she traced the intricate network of interpersonal dynamics, noting how trust, suspicion, and hidden agendas influenced behavior, and how the timing of statements, gestures, and movements could serve both to reveal and conceal information, to mislead or illuminate, depending on the awareness of the observer. The household staff moved quietly, their steps measured and precise, yet Miss Marple, attuned to the rhythm of their activities, discerned the subtle cues that suggested knowledge beyond their apparent duties. A soft exchange of words, a careful positioning of an object, a fleeting glance toward the letter, or a momentary hesitation before responding to a guest's request. She understood that these small gestures often concealed awareness, complicity, or concern, and that the hidden letter might serve as a touchstone for these undercurrents, revealing the alignment or misalignment of intentions, loyalties, and knowledge within the manner. By the afternoon, the weight of anticipation grew, subtle yet persistent, threading through the manor like an invisible current. Miss Marple catalogued the interactions with increasing clarity, observing how the letter influenced behavior, how the presence of certain guests affected the timing of remarks and movements, and how the manor itself, its architecture, furnishings, and layout, shaped and constrained the actions of both staff and visitors. Chapter 10: Shadows of the Past. As twilight settled over Ashcroft Manor, casting long, hesitant shadows across the gardens and hallways, Miss Marple remained quietly observant, seated near the window in the library, where the fading light fell upon her hands and the open book she pretended to read, though her mind was far from the printed words, instead tracing the subtle patterns of behavior, the slight tremors of anxiety, and the fleeting gestures of those who moved through the manor with purpose or pretense, for she knew that shadows, both literal and metaphorical, often revealed as much as daylight, exposing the concealed histories, grudges, and loyalties that shaped human interactions, and she catalogued each observed detail with the calm precision of someone accustomed to reading beyond appearances, discerning the hidden narrative woven into the ordinary movements of the household. Even the servants, who went about their duties with measured care, carried in their gestures, pauses, and glances the echo of past events, rivalries, and confidences, and Miss Marple, with her gentle yet penetrating attention, traced these invisible threads, understanding that nothing in Ashcroft Manor occurred in isolation, that each moment was influenced by history, relationships, and the subtle weight of secrets. The drawing-room, where the remaining guests had gathered, resonated with polite conversation, the careful clink of teacups, and the soft rustle of skirts and footsteps, yet beneath this veneer of propriety, Miss Marple sensed the undercurrents of apprehension, curiosity, and unspoken knowledge, each glance, word, and gesture layered with meaning, providing a silent map of alliances, suspicions, and unacknowledged tensions. She noted how the timing of comments, the direction of attention, and the measured pauses in conversation acted as indicators of concealed intent or suppressed emotion, and she catalogued these subtle signals with the same meticulous attention she had devoted to the morning's observations of the hidden letter, understanding that human behavior often revealed far more than spoken words. Earlier that day, she had observed a minor disturbance near the servants' staircase, a subtle rearrangement of a vase and a soft sigh from a passing maid, incidents that might have appeared trivial to casual eyes, yet Miss Marple interpreted them as part of a delicate choreography, the silent language of those aware of hidden knowledge, and she considered how such small, almost imperceptible actions could indicate awareness of, or complicity in, events related to the funeral invitation and the mysteries of Ashcroft Manor. Her mind connected these details to previous observations, noting the patterns of avoidance, subtle deference, and guarded expression among both guests and staff, recognizing that the manor itself acted as a stage upon which the past and present collided in a quiet, yet potent, interplay of secrecy and revelation. The hidden letter, still lingering in her thoughts, provided an additional lens through which to view the day's interactions, its contents illuminating potential motives, fears, and alliances, while its very secrecy suggested the delicate handling of sensitive information and the latent power of knowledge. Miss Marple considered the implications of who might have delivered the letter, why it had been placed in a particular location, and how the knowledge of its existence had rippled through the household, affecting behavior, fostering suspicion, and subtly guiding the social dynamics that she had so carefully traced, from the smallest gestures to the most seemingly casual remarks. Throughout the afternoon, she had observed how the funeral invitation itself acted as both catalyst and mirror, bringing to the surface latent anxieties, long-held grudges, and unspoken fears, revealing how past events shaped present behavior and how the social choreography of Ashcroft Manor concealed as much as it revealed. She noted the nuanced reactions of the guests to references made in passing, the slight hesitation before answering questions, and the deliberate avoidance of certain topics, all indicators of knowledge, guilt, or apprehension, and she wove these strands together in her mind, constructing a detailed map of relationships, potential motives, and the hidden pressures exerted by history, circumstance, and proximity. In the soft glow of candlelight, the manor appeared to transform, its corridors elongated, shadows deepened, and familiar objects taking on unfamiliar shapes, creating an atmosphere that encouraged vigilance and heightened awareness. Miss Marple, attuned to the interplay of light and shadow, considered how such environmental factors might influence perception, reveal concealed truths, or inspire inadvertent revelations, noting how the shifting illumination affected posture, glance, and timing among both staff and guests, and integrating these observations into her growing mental picture of opportunity, secrecy, and behavioral dynamics. The subtle interplay of authority, social expectation, and concealed knowledge became increasingly apparent as the evening progressed. Miss Marple recognized the careful balance maintained by the housekeeper in managing both the servants and the guests, the delicate manner in which the butler orchestrated timing, movement, and observation, and the way the youngest staff members adjusted their behavior based on hints, gestures, and cues from those with greater knowledge, each layer of social and psychological interaction providing insight into potential motivations and hidden agendas, and she catalogued these with unwavering attention, recognizing that such seemingly minor details often held the key to understanding the full complexity of the situation. The library, with its shelves of carefully arranged books and polished surfaces, became both sanctuary and observatory, allowing Miss Marple to observe without being observed, and she noted how each visitor's choice of seat, angle of approach, and timing of entrance or departure could serve as both a reflection of intention and a concealment of knowledge. These subtle patterns, when combined with information gleaned from prior observations, the hidden letter, and the ongoing influence of the funeral invitation, formed a rich tapestry of data from which she could deduce connections, motives, and potential outcomes, always tempered by her understanding that human behavior was rarely straightforward, often layered, and sometimes contradictory. By late evening, as the household settled into quiet activity, Miss Marple reflected on the cumulative insights of the day, noting how interactions among guests, the staff, and the hidden letter revealed subtle alignments of interest, concealed concerns, and unspoken relationships, and she began to anticipate the potential developments that the morrow might bring, the careful observation of gestures, conversation, and environmental cues forming a roadmap toward eventual understanding, revelation, and resolution. She understood that patience, attentiveness, and subtle inference were paramount, that each detail, however minor, was part of a larger pattern, and that the careful weaving together of behavioral, environmental, and documentary clues would ultimately uncover the hidden truths surrounding Ashcroft Manor and the funeral invitation that had quietly disturbed its equilibrium. The quiet murmur of conversation, the soft footfalls of the staff, and the gentle flicker of candlelight underscored the manifold interactions. Chapter 11. Echoes in the Garden. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and flowering shrubs, as Miss Marple made her careful rounds of the Ashcroft Manor gardens, her steps measured and unobtrusive, her eyes scanning the patterns of dew on the grass, the alignment of pathways, and the subtle disturbances in flower beds and shrubbery that might otherwise escape notice, for she understood that the garden, like the manor itself, held secrets and subtle signs of human presence, from footprints and displaced leaves to bent stems and shifted stones, each small detail offering potential insight into movement, intention, and timing. She observed how the sunlight fell through the high branches of ancient trees, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that both concealed and revealed, noting how the shifting illumination might obscure evidence or highlight anomalies. And she catalogued these environmental factors with the same meticulous attention she devoted to human behavior, recognizing that nature and circumstance often interacted with human action to shape events and perceptions, and that understanding these interactions could prove crucial in deciphering the mystery surrounding the funeral invitation. The servants moved with quiet efficiency, their measured footfalls and precise handling of tools and materials providing subtle clues to the routines, habits, and hierarchies within the household, and Miss Marple, attuned to these rhythms, observed not only what was done but how, when, and by whom, noting the differences between practiced efficiency and small deviations that might indicate distraction, secrecy, or knowledge of matters beyond their apparent duties, she reflected on the layered interplay between staff behavior and guest activity, considering how social hierarchy, loyalty, and discretion influenced each gesture, glance, and pause, and how these elements combined to form a complex web of observable and hidden dynamics that she could interpret to uncover truth. Guests had begun to wander into the garden, ostensibly for fresh air, yet Miss Marple noted the careful timing of entrances and exits, the angles of approach to particular flower beds, and the subtle clustering of individuals into groups, each arrangement hinting at alliances, suspicions, and the unspoken awareness of past events. She observed how smiles, nods, and gestures were employed both to mask concern and convey silent communication, cataloging these micro-interactions as evidence of the underlying currents that flowed through the household, and she considered how these behaviors, when combined with prior observations and the knowledge of the hidden letter, formed a pattern of relational dynamics essential to understanding the motivations and fears influencing the unfolding mystery. The garden paths led her past fountains, marble statues, and neatly clipped hedges, each element a potential site for observation, concealment, or revelation, and she noted the alignment and condition of each, recognizing that the placement of objects and the subtle disturbance of their surroundings could indicate prior presence, movement, or intention, and that such environmental cues were as valuable as spoken testimony in reconstructing events. She traced the pathways mentally, observing the intersections where shadow and light shifted, the locations where individuals paused, and the subtle signals exchanged in passing, integrating these details into her growing understanding of timing, opportunity, and human interaction, and noting how even the quietest corners might hold critical information if approached with patience and attentiveness. A sudden rustle among the shrubs caught her attention, and she paused, observing the shifting shadows and the way the wind interacted with the foliage, realizing that even natural movements could mask or highlight human presence. She considered the possibility that prior night's activities, footprints, and disturbances had left traces now visible in the interplay of light, moisture, and shadow, and she catalogued these carefully, noting how the alignment of stones, the bent stems of flowers, and the pressed grass could indicate recent passage, movement of objects, or even the concealment of notes or small items, and she weighed each possibility against the broader context of the manor, its residents, and the mysterious funeral invitation that had initiated the unfolding events. As she moved toward the far end of the garden, the presence of the greenhouse drew her attention, the glass panes reflecting light in patterns that both obscured and revealed, and she noted how the arrangement of plants, gardening tools, and foot traffic could provide insight into who had been present, when, and with what purpose, understanding that the careful observation of mundane details often illuminated hidden intentions. She catalogued the placement of watering cans, the slight tilt of potted plants, and the minute traces of soil on paths, recognizing that these small signs, when combined with behavioral observations and knowledge of personal relationships, formed a cumulative picture that would ultimately clarify the mystery's puzzle pieces. Throughout the morning, Miss Marple's attention remained unwavering, noting the subtle differences between those who moved with genuine purpose and those whose actions were guided by concealment or deception, observing how glances, body orientation, and micro-expressions conveyed awareness or ignorance, trust or suspicion. She catalogued these nuances alongside environmental cues, understanding that the interrelation of human behavior, spatial arrangement, and temporal sequence formed a lattice upon which truth could be discerned. In one secluded corner of the garden, she noticed a faint impression in the soil, partially obscured by fallen leaves, suggesting recent movement or the passage of a small object, and she paused to consider its implications, tracing the pattern of footsteps mentally, comparing it to prior observations, and reflecting on how this minor detail might reveal opportunity, timing, or the presence of knowledge concealed from others. She noted how the nearby arrangement of benches, statues, and hedges could have served both as cover and as points of observation, integrating these spatial relationships into her understanding of who might have moved where, at what time, and for what purpose. The interplay of sunlight, shadow, human presence, and the subtle influence of prior events created an intricate tableau, each element layered with meaning, and Miss Marple, patient and observant, followed the invisible threads connecting gestures, movements, and minor disturbances, building a mental map of relations, motives, and opportunities. She considered how alliances, rivalries, and hidden knowledge manifested in the smallest actions, and how the careful synthesis of these observations, combined with information from the hidden letter and the dynamics of the funeral invitation, could reveal the alignment of intentions and the concealed truths that had quietly shaped the household. By midday, the garden had become a stage of both visible and hidden interactions, where glances, pauses, and movements carried weight far beyond their apparent significance, and Miss Marple catalogued each detail with unwavering attention, understanding that the patterns of behavior, when integrated with environmental observations, could illuminate motive, opportunity, and the subtle interplay of secrecy and revelation that characterized Ashcroft Manor. Chapter 12. The Quiet Confession. By late afternoon, a subtle hush had fallen over Ashcroft Manor, a pause in the usual rhythm of movement and conversation that allowed the smallest gestures and the most fleeting expressions to carry weight, and Miss Marple, seated quietly by the tall bay window in the east wing, observed with unwavering attention, cataloguing the intricate interplay of behavior, environment, and circumstance that she knew could ultimately reveal the truth, for she had long understood that silence often spoke more loudly than words, and that a careful observer could read between gestures, pauses, and fleeting glances to discern intention, fear, and knowledge. The manor, with its labyrinthine corridors, ornate furnishings, and gardens visible through the glass, became a stage upon which the interplay of secrecy, loyalty, and suspicion played out in subtle, almost imperceptible patterns, each action and reaction a clue to the hidden currents shaping events, and Miss Marple, patient and attentive, noted every detail. Earlier, she had observed the butler arranging the afternoon tea with meticulous care, the precise alignment of cups, saucers, and teaspoons reflecting a mind attuned to order and control, and she considered how these small, deliberate actions could indicate a desire to assert authority, manage perception, or conceal personal knowledge. Similarly, the housekeeper's quiet movements through the corridors, the measured rhythm of her footsteps, and the way she interacted with the servants and guests offered subtle evidence of alliances, information, and influence, and Miss Marple catalogued these observations alongside the behavior of the visiting guests, tracing the interactions, overlaps, and deviations from expected patterns with an experienced eye, noting how minor anomalies might suggest hidden tensions, grudges, or awareness of events yet unspoken. In the drawing-room, a soft murmur of voices accompanied the occasional clink of fine china, the gentle rustle of silk, and the subtle creaking of floorboards, all of which Miss Marple interpreted as part of the complex social choreography that both revealed and concealed knowledge, for in such a household, every motion, pause, and glance could indicate alignment, avoidance, or the careful negotiation of social and personal boundaries, and she observed how each guest positioned themselves in relation to others, the timing of their entrances and departures, and the angles at which they approached or avoided conversation, recognizing that these patterns formed a silent language through which secrets were communicated and intentions hinted, a language she had long since mastered. Miss Marple's attention then turned to the hidden letter, which remained in her mental catalogue as a crucial piece of the puzzle. Its content, though partially obscured by ambiguity, suggested motives, fears, and knowledge that influenced behavior throughout the manor, and she considered how awareness of the letter's existence affected actions, conversations, and the subtle dynamics of observation and concealment, understanding that the mere presence of sensitive information could guide both deliberate deception and inadvertent revelation, and that careful synthesis of these behavioral cues with environmental observation could illuminate connections, timing, and intent that were otherwise invisible. The afternoon sun shifted across the floor, casting long shadows that revealed imperfections and irregularities, subtle dips in the carpet, and faint impressions in the polished wood that Miss Marple noted, recognizing how these minor disturbances might indicate prior movement, concealed items, or deviations from normal routine, and she integrated these observations with her awareness of human behavior, noting the potential for inadvertent revelation, the strategic manipulation of environment, and the subtle choreography of movement that reflected knowledge, secrecy, and influence. She catalogued the placement of chairs, the spacing of tables, and the alignment of decorative objects as indicators of how space was used and perceived, and how these patterns might reveal intention or concealment, adding another layer of insight to her mental map of opportunity, motive, and timing. Later, in the library, she observed the youngest staff members whispering in hushed tones, their glances toward certain guests and avoidance of others speaking volumes of their awareness, fear, or curiosity, and she considered how the transmission of small pieces of information, intentionally or inadvertently, could ripple through the household, subtly affecting behavior, decision-making, and the management of perception. She catalogued these interactions alongside the structured movements of senior staff and the careful responses of the guests, building a comprehensive view of influence, communication, and concealment, and noting how these factors would inform the eventual understanding of motive, opportunity, and alignment in the mystery surrounding the funeral invitation. A sudden knock at the east wing door briefly startled her, though she remained composed, observing how the interruption affected behavior in the room, the shifts in posture, the change in attention, and the subtle recalibration of conversation and movement, all of which she noted in meticulous detail, understanding that such deviations from routine often revealed unspoken priorities, fears, or knowledge. The visitor's brief entry and polite withdrawal were catalogued not only for their immediate effect but also for their broader implications, considering how timing, sequence, and awareness intersected in ways that could reveal hidden truths, relationships, and concealed intentions. The quiet confession, though unspoken, lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she traced back through her catalogue of observations, noting how subtle signs of stress, hesitation, and indirect communication provided insight into internal conflicts, suppressed anxieties, and concealed awareness. She reflected on how the past, present, and anticipated future intertwined within the microcosm of the manner, and how the carefully observed patterns of movement, gesture, and response could ultimately illuminate the precise alignment of events, timing, and motivation necessary to resolve the mystery, revealing the careful orchestration of behavior, concealment, and revelation that had quietly shaped the day's unfolding events. By evening, as shadows lengthened and the air cooled, Miss Marple reviewed her mental catalogue, integrating observations of the garden, hallways, library, and drawing room with behavioral cues, subtle signals, and environmental evidence, tracing the invisible threads connecting gestures, glances, and movements across spaces and time. And she began to anticipate how these threads might converge to illuminate the identity of those privy to concealed knowledge, the motivations behind concealed actions, and the sequence of events that had unfolded under the guise of ordinary propriety. She understood that patience, attention to detail, and careful synthesis of observation and inference were the tools that would ultimately reveal the truth behind Ashcroft Manor and the disruptive funeral invitation, exposing hidden motives and unspoken histories in a way that only careful, unobtrusive observation could achieve. Chapter 13. Shadows in the Hall. As the late afternoon waned into early evening, a subtle shift fell over Ashcroft Manor, the once lively corridors now muted, the echoes of footsteps, whispers, and rustling fabric carrying more weight than usual, and Miss Marple, seated in a quiet corner near the grand staircase, observed everything with careful precision, noting how the interplay of light and shadow cast across the polished wooden floors and the intricate tapestries revealed subtle signs of recent movement, minor disturbances in rugs and furniture, and tiny imperfections in the alignment of decorative objects, all of which might point to the passage of someone seeking concealment or attempting to manipulate perception. She understood that in a household of this size and complexity, every shadow, every shift in light, and every seemingly inconsequential adjustment could carry meaning, whether intentional or inadvertent, and that careful attention to these details was crucial to unraveling the layered mystery surrounding the funeral invitation. The servants moved with quiet efficiency, their actions deliberate yet varied, and Miss Marple catalogued the subtle differences between those who executed their duties with practiced precision and those whose movements suggested distraction, unease, or hidden knowledge, noting the angles of glances exchanged between staff and guests, the hesitant pauses, and the slight deviations from routine, all of which might hint at secrets, loyalties, or suppressed anxieties. She recognized that these minor variations in behavior were often more revealing than words, that small inconsistencies could betray awareness or complicity, and that observing the subtleties of body language and timing provided insights into relationships, tensions, and hidden agendas. In the grand drawing room, a faint murmur of conversation continued, accompanied by the occasional clink of fine china, and Miss Marple noted the precise positioning of chairs, the spacing of tables, and the orientation of individuals as they interacted, all of which reflected not only social hierarchy but also subtle alliances, rivalries, and unspoken dynamics. She catalogued these observations in tandem with environmental cues, the slight tilt of a vase, a moved book, the arrangement of curtains allowing light to fall unevenly, considering how these elements could indicate prior passage, observation, or intentional concealment, and how the interplay between human behavior and environmental manipulation might reveal motivations, opportunities, or concealed knowledge relevant to the mystery. Miss Marple's attention then turned to the library, where she observed the careful cataloging of books and documents, noting minor discrepancies in the order of volumes, the displacement of papers, and subtle marks on the desk that suggested prior activity. She considered how these small details could indicate the retrieval, concealment, or inspection of information, and how they might connect to the letter she had kept secret and the broader implications of the funeral invitation, recognizing that the careful synthesis of these environmental and behavioral cues was essential to reconstructing the sequence of events, understanding motives, and discerning the alignment of intentions that underpinned the unfolding drama. Throughout the corridors and rooms, Miss Marple's keen eye caught minute signs of tension, a slightly clenched fist resting on a table, a hesitant glance exchanged between two guests, the brief stiffening of posture upon noticing a movement in the hallway. She catalogued these signals, integrating them with prior knowledge of relationships, past conflicts, and subtle behavioral patterns, understanding that the convergence of these small, often overlooked gestures could illuminate hidden awareness, suppressed emotions, and concealed agendas, all of which might be critical to identifying who knew what, when, and why, and how these threads intersected with the greater narrative of Ashcroft Manor and its enigmatic funeral invitation. As the shadows deepened and the light shifted, Miss Marple traced the invisible pathways of interaction, noting how individuals navigated the spaces of the manor, the timing of entrances and exits, and the subtle choreography of movement that reflected both opportunity and concealment. She considered how knowledge of the funeral invitation had influenced behavior, prompted secrecy, and created tension, and how the careful observation of spatial dynamics, micro-expressions, and unspoken communication could reveal underlying truths about alliances, motives, and opportunity, forming a mental map that would guide her to understanding the connections between people, objects, and events. In the West Wing, she noticed minor disturbances in the arrangement of furniture and decorative items, slight indentations in carpets, and the misalignment of rugs, each of which suggested prior passage or concealed activity. She catalogued these environmental cues alongside behavioral observations, assessing the likelihood that certain movements were deliberate, opportunistic, or inadvertent, and considering how these subtle indications could inform her understanding of who had been present, what actions had occurred, and how the orchestration of space, time, and attention might point toward concealed knowledge or intentional misdirection. Miss Marple reflected on the interplay between observed behavior and environmental evidence, noting that even small details, a shifted chair, an abandoned teacup, a misplaced letter, could provide insight into timing, opportunity, and intention, particularly when integrated with patterns of social interaction, hidden tensions, and the psychological dynamics of the household. She catalogued each element meticulously, building a comprehensive mental reconstruction of events that would allow her to anticipate, interpret, and ultimately reveal the hidden truths that shaped the interactions, decisions, and concealments of all involved. The quiet of the manor allowed Miss Marple to focus on microsignals that might otherwise go unnoticed. The brief hesitation before responding to a question, a subtle shift in weight indicating discomfort or awareness, the direction of a glance that suggested hidden observation. She integrated these behavioral cues with environmental evidence, the known history of the manor's residents, and the context of the funeral invitation, tracing patterns that linked gestures, locations, and timing to motive, opportunity, and potential concealment, forming an intricate web of inference that guided her reasoning and informed her conclusions. By evening, Miss Marple had catalogued countless small details: the alignment of furniture, the arrangement of objects, the shifting shadows, the timing of movements, and the subtleties of behavior. She had observed interactions in the drawing room, the library, the hallways, and the gardens, integrating these observations into a cohesive understanding of how knowledge, suspicion, and intention moved through Ashcroft Manor, shaping action and perception alike, and she began to anticipate how these threads might converge to illuminate hidden truths, reveal motives, and clarify the sequence of events that had unfolded since the arrival of the funeral invitation. Each subtle signal, each minor disturbance, and each fleeting gesture contributed to a larger picture that Miss Marple could decipher, allowing her to trace opportunity. Chapter 14. The Unseen Passage. As the evening deepened and shadows lengthened across the polished floors and ornate furnishings of Ashcroft Manor, a certain hush settled over the corridors, broken only by the measured steps of the servants, the distant ticking of the grand hall clock, and the occasional whisper that seemed to linger longer than ordinary conversation, and Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner of the East Wing drawing-room, observed all with her usual attentive calm, noting the subtleties of posture, gesture, and expression as the household adjusted to the muted tension that had quietly crept over the estate since the arrival of the funeral invitation. She understood that in such a complex environment, where every individual carried secrets, histories, and unspoken alliances, the smallest movement, the briefest hesitation, or the most fleeting glance could carry weight far beyond its apparent insignificance, revealing connections, intentions, and awareness that were otherwise invisible to casual observation. Her attention first settled on the library, where the faint scent of old books mingled with the subtle aroma of polished wood and fading candles, creating an atmosphere that seemed to encourage introspection and inadvertent confession, and she catalogued the slightest irregularities in the arrangement of volumes, the displacement of papers, and the subtle impressions left on the desk, each anomaly hinting at movement, concealment, or hurried activity, and she considered how these small environmental clues might align with behavioral observations to illuminate hidden knowledge or intentional obfuscation, understanding that the integration of these details would be crucial to reconstructing the sequence of events and the motivations behind them. In the grand drawing room, the guests' movements were equally revealing, the carefully measured approach to conversations, the subtle shifts in seating, and the direction of glances suggesting alliances, rivalries, and unspoken negotiations, and Miss Marple noted the timing of entrances and departures, the slight hesitation before responding to questions, and the micro-expressions that fleetingly betrayed awareness or anxiety, cataloging each subtle cue as part of a larger map of perception, influence, and concealed knowledge. She observed how the interplay of environment and behavior created a complex network of opportunity, concealment, and revelation, where even the placement of a chair or the alignment of a table could contribute to the broader understanding of the household's dynamics and the mysteries surrounding the funeral invitation. As the manor's halls echoed with the faint footsteps of those moving between rooms, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the small, almost imperceptible details, the impressions left by shoes in the hallway carpet, a slightly ajar door leading to an unused wing, a faint smudge on the polished floor suggesting recent passage, and the soft rustle of curtains that indicated attention or observation, all of which were meticulously catalogued and integrated with her understanding of human behavior, timing, and opportunity, allowing her to trace patterns of movement, concealment, and intent that were otherwise hidden from view. The quiet servants' whispers, the careful management of space and attention by the senior staff, and the subtle recalibration of conversation and posture by the guests all contributed to a layered understanding of the interplay between knowledge, secrecy, and perception, and Miss Marple noted how these interactions, both deliberate and inadvertent, formed a lattice of information that could reveal alignment, motivation, and opportunity when synthesized with environmental cues, past behavior, and contextual understanding, highlighting the delicate balance between concealment and inadvertent revelation that governed Ashcroft Manor. Turning her attention to the east wing corridors, she observed the patterns of movement that suggested hidden passage or awareness of otherwise unnoticed spaces, noting minor disturbances in rugs, the slight misalignment of decorative objects, and the almost imperceptible adjustments in lighting caused by partially drawn curtains, all of which could indicate the passage of someone seeking concealment or attempting to manipulate perception, and she integrated these observations with prior knowledge of relationships, motivations, and the subtle influence of the funeral invitation to form a cohesive understanding of the sequence of events, hidden alliances, and unspoken intentions that shaped the evening. Even the smallest gestures, an unsteady hand reaching for a cup, a delayed response to a question, a brief but meaningful glance exchanged between two individuals, were catalogued meticulously, revealing internal conflict, awareness of hidden information, or subtle attempts to guide perception, and Miss Marple noted how these behavioral cues intersected with environmental evidence, historical knowledge of the residents, and the psychological undercurrents of the household, forming a complex and interconnected map of observation, inference, and insight that would ultimately illuminate the hidden truths of Ashcroft Manor. In the dimming light, she traced invisible lines connecting gestures, movements, and positions, noting how the interplay of light, shadow, and reflection could alter perception and influence behavior, and how individuals' awareness of these environmental dynamics might shape their actions in ways both deliberate and unconscious, adding another layer to the web of observation, inference, and anticipation that she was constructing. She understood that each detail, no matter how minute, could provide a crucial link in understanding who knew what, when, and why, and how the funeral invitation had catalyzed hidden knowledge, suppressed tensions, and subtle maneuvering throughout the manor. Miss Marple's focus then returned to the library, where the arrangement of objects, the alignment of furniture, and the placement of documents revealed small but meaningful anomalies, suggesting that someone had been there recently, perhaps retrieving or hiding information, or attempting to manipulate the perception of space for strategic purposes. And she catalogued these observations in relation to her broader understanding of human behavior, environmental cues, and the sequence of events, appreciating how the integration of these factors would illuminate motivation, opportunity, and concealment in the unfolding mystery. As night approached, and the manor's lamps cast a golden glow across the polished wood and ornate furnishings, she noted how the subtle interplay of light and shadow highlighted imperfections, adjustments, and movements that might otherwise have gone unnoticed, each detail contributing to the layered understanding of behavior, secrecy, and awareness that Miss Marple carefully catalogued, integrating observations from the drawing room, library, hallways, and even the seldom-used wings of the house to reconstruct a coherent picture of opportunity, intent, and alignment that would guide her to uncovering the hidden truths surrounding the funeral invitation. The quiet murmur of servants, the distant echoes of footsteps, and the occasional whisper of fabric shifting all contributed to a complex tableau of behavior and environmental evidence, and Miss Marple, with her customary patience, catalogued each element. Chapter 15. The Locked Study. As the evening deepened and the last hints of daylight faded from Ashcroft Manor, a hush fell over the household, broken only by the distant ticking of the grand clock in the hall, and Miss Marple, seated quietly in a shadowed corner of the west wing, focused her attention on the locked study at the end of the corridor, a room that had long been the center of intrigue and whispered speculation, for it was here that documents, letters, and objects of importance had been kept out of sight from all but the closest family members, and she knew that any clue, no matter how small, hidden within or near this room could be vital to unraveling the mystery surrounding the funeral invitation. She observed the heavy oak door, its brass handle polished to a muted gleam, the faint scratch marks along the edges suggesting repeated use or perhaps attempts to manipulate the lock, and the slight variations in the surrounding carpet and floorboards that hinted at movement and attention, noting how these subtle environmental cues could indicate not only access but also concealment, deliberate or otherwise, and the presence of a careful observer would transform these small details into meaningful evidence. Throughout the manor, the household moved with quiet deliberation, servants gliding through corridors and rooms with practiced ease, and Miss Marple catalogued each movement, noting which actions were mechanical, which were hesitant, and which betrayed subtle anxiety or awareness, for she understood that human behavior, in combination with environmental clues, often revealed far more than words ever could. She noticed the careful positioning of furniture, the alignment of chairs and tables, and the occasional slight displacement of objects in rooms adjacent to the locked study, all of which could indicate prior activity, passage, or observation, and she integrated these observations with knowledge of past routines, interpersonal dynamics, and potential motives, creating a mental map that traced not only opportunity but also intent and concealment. The quiet murmur of conversation drifted from the drawing room, punctuated by the occasional clink of fine china or the soft creak of floorboards, and Miss Marple noted how guests and family members navigated the manor, the subtle hesitations before entering certain rooms, the brief glances exchanged when the study's door was mentioned, and the almost imperceptible stiffening of posture when a sensitive topic arose. She catalogued each of these cues alongside environmental evidence, the faint indentations on the carpet near the study door, the slight scuff marks on the hallway floor, and the displacement of objects near the entrance, all of which formed a complex pattern of observation, opportunity, and subtle concealment, revealing layers of human behavior that might otherwise have remained invisible. Miss Marple's attention then shifted to the study's exterior, where she observed the shadows cast by the flickering lamps, noting how light and darkness played across the door and surrounding furniture, highlighting irregularities, subtle scratches, and areas where dust or polish had been disturbed, indicating recent handling or careful attention. She considered how these minor disturbances could reflect clandestine passage, observation, or manipulation, and how they might correlate with behavioral cues observed in the drawing room, corridors, and adjacent spaces, forming a cohesive understanding of who had been present, what actions had been taken, and how the interplay of opportunity, concealment, and knowledge could illuminate the motives and intentions of those involved. Throughout the West Wing, subtle signals of anxiety and awareness appeared in small gestures, a tightened grip on a railing, a brief pause before entering a hallway, a glance toward the study door that lingered just a fraction longer than usual, and Miss Marple catalogued each with meticulous care, integrating them with environmental observations and prior knowledge of interpersonal dynamics, past conflicts, and secretive tendencies, recognizing that the convergence of these factors would provide critical insight into the unfolding mystery, revealing who might have had reason to access the study, what they sought, and what might have been hidden from view. The arrangement of objects near the study, a small cabinet, a set of books, a writing desk, showed subtle signs of disturbance. A shifted book, a slightly open drawer, the faint indentation of papers, all suggesting prior attention, handling, or concealment, and Miss Marple noted how these seemingly minor irregularities could provide the clues necessary to understand the timing, sequence, and intention behind actions related to the locked study, particularly in relation to the sensitive contents it might hold and the significance of the funeral invitation in catalyzing hidden knowledge and suppressed tensions. As night settled over Ashcroft Manor and the lamps cast a warm, golden glow across the corridors, Miss Marple observed the alignment of shadows, the play of light on the polished wood, and the subtle changes in spatial perception caused by flickering illumination, understanding how environmental factors could influence behavior, manipulate perception, and provide concealment. And she catalogued these cues in conjunction with her observations of human action, micro-expressions, and gestural subtleties, forming a comprehensive map that traced opportunity, awareness, and intent throughout the manor. Even the smallest signals, an unconscious touch to a locket, a brief hesitation before entering a room, a careful adjustment of a garment, were noted and integrated into Miss Marple's mental reconstruction of events, revealing awareness, suppressed knowledge, or attempts at concealment, and when combined with the environmental anomalies, the displaced rug, the faint scuff on the floor, the slightly misaligned books and papers, they formed a pattern that traced movement, observation, and intention across Ashcroft Manor, offering insight into hidden motives, subtle alliances, and potential misdirection. Miss Marple's patient and meticulous attention extended to the staff, whose movements, gestures, and attentiveness revealed more than casual observation might suggest. She noted the timing of their tasks, the slight deviation from routine, and the brief but telling glances exchanged among them, understanding that these behaviors, when integrated with environmental evidence and prior knowledge of interpersonal dynamics, could illuminate hidden knowledge, complicity, or attempts to manipulate perception, and she catalogued these cues as part of the broader tapestry of observation and inference that would ultimately guide her toward the truth. By the late evening, the manor had fallen into a careful rhythm of motion and stillness, with moments of quiet reflection punctuated by subtle disturbances, and Miss Marple, observing the locked study and the surrounding spaces, integrated all cues, environmental, behavioral, temporal, and relational, into a cohesive mental reconstruction, tracing pathways of movement, points of observation, and potential concealment, mapping opportunity, awareness, and intent, and considering how each detail related to the others in revealing hidden motives, secret knowledge, and the subtle orchestration of actions that had taken place since the arrival of the funeral invitation. In her mind, she combined micro-expressions, environmental anomalies, timing, movement patterns. Chapter 16. Secrets Behind the Portraits. As the early hours of the morning crept quietly over Ashcroft Manor, a delicate stillness settled over the grand hallways and opulent chambers, yet within that stillness there was an undercurrent of tension, the subtle hum of anticipation that Miss Marple, seated comfortably in a shadowed alcove, had learned to recognize as the presence of hidden knowledge and unspoken truths, for in a house such as this, where the weight of history, legacy, and inheritance pressed upon every polished surface, and beneath every carefully arranged piece of furniture, the smallest irregularities often carried the greatest significance, and Miss Marple's keen observation extended beyond mere human behavior to the silent testimony of the environment itself. Her eyes wandered slowly over the portraits lining the east wing, each frame meticulously polished, each canvas capturing the features and expressions of generations long past. Yet she noticed what others might dismiss, the faint smudges on certain frames, the slight tilt of a painting that had ostensibly been straight for decades, the barely perceptible accumulation of dust in corners where it should not have been, and she considered how such subtle shifts could reflect recent interaction, concealed access, or careful manipulation, all of which could provide insight into the hidden movements, secret searches, or suppressed intentions of those who had traversed these halls in the previous hours. The grand hall itself, with its sweeping staircase, polished balustrades, and intricate rugs, offered further clues to the discerning observer, and Miss Marple catalogued the faint impressions of footsteps on the carpet, noting variations in direction, weight, and hesitation, integrating these into her broader understanding of timing, opportunity, and behavior. For she knew that even the slightest misstep or deliberate adjustment could illuminate the path of a person seeking concealment or attempting to manipulate perception, and she traced these lines in conjunction with her observations of the subtle interactions between family members, guests, and staff, all of whom moved within the manor under the heavy yet invisible influence of secrets, unspoken agreements, and the silent pressure imposed by the recent arrival of the funeral invitation. Miss Marple's attention lingered on a series of portraits depicting past matriarchs and patriarchs, their eyes rendered with such intensity that they seemed almost to observe the present, and she noted how the placement and condition of these frames, their occasional tilt or misalignment, the faint abrasions along the edges, and even the reflective gleam of varnished surfaces could suggest prior contact or deliberate adjustment, perhaps by someone seeking or concealing a critical document, item, or clue, and she integrated these environmental indicators with her understanding of human behavior, timing, and motive, forming a mental map of opportunity and awareness that would prove essential in reconstructing the sequence of hidden actions. Throughout the manor, small details accumulated into a tapestry of evidence: the displacement of a chair near the library, a faint smudge on the polished hallway floor, the subtle realignment of objects on side tables, the almost imperceptible movement of curtains in rooms with open windows, and the patterns of light and shadow cast by flickering lamps and candles, all of which spoke silently of attention, passage, and concealed observation. Miss Marple catalogued each with a careful patience that had long served her in unraveling the hidden truths of human conduct, understanding that the convergence of environmental, behavioral, and temporal evidence could illuminate intentions that words alone would never reveal. Even the quietest of actions, a hand pausing over a doorknob, a hesitant glance toward a corridor, a slight adjustment of clothing, were significant, and Miss Marple considered how these gestures, when combined with environmental anomalies, historical context, and interpersonal dynamics, could reveal awareness, anxiety, or the deliberate concealment of knowledge, forming a web of inference and deduction that extended through every room, hallway, and corridor of Ashcroft Manor, ultimately pointing toward hidden motives, suppressed secrets, and the careful orchestration of movement and perception by those seeking to protect or obscure critical truths. In her contemplation of the portraits, Miss Marple also observed how attention to detail in alignment, spacing, and condition could signify priority, awareness, or access, and she integrated these subtle indicators with the behavioral observations she had made over the preceding hours, noting how hesitation, micro-expressions, and fleeting gestures intersected with environmental cues to reveal patterns of concealment, intentional misdirection, and the flow of knowledge within the manor. She mapped the connections between movement, awareness, and opportunity, understanding that these links would be crucial in tracing the path of those whose intentions remained hidden behind polite facades and carefully measured manners. Throughout the east wing and adjacent corridors, Miss Marple traced lines connecting the portraits, their orientation, and the objects around them with the movements of staff and guests, the slight disturbances of carpets, the adjustments of furniture, and the temporary misalignments of decorative items, noting how the accumulation of these small, seemingly unrelated details formed a coherent picture of human behavior, attention, and concealed activity. She recognized that by synthesizing environmental evidence with subtle cues of gesture, expression, and interaction, she could reconstruct the sequence of hidden actions, identify points of opportunity and concealment, and anticipate the eventual revelations that would emerge from the web of secrets surrounding the funeral invitation. The quiet ticking of clocks, the soft creaking of floorboards, and the faint murmur of distant conversation all contributed to a complex interplay of sound and perception, and Miss Marple integrated these auditory cues with her visual observations, noting how timing, hesitation, and awareness manifested in both movement and the modulation of sound, providing insight into concealed activity, surveillance, or deliberate misdirection, and she traced these signals through the spatial arrangement of the manor, the alignment of portraits, and the subtle interplay of light and shadow to map the likely movements, intentions, and awareness of individuals throughout the night. Miss Marple's focus extended to the interactions of those she had observed earlier. The careful calibration of conversation, the measured gestures of politeness, the fleeting expressions of recognition or hesitation, and the almost imperceptible shifts in posture when certain subjects arose, all of which she catalogued as evidence of concealed knowledge, suppressed emotions, and strategic positioning. And she considered how these behavioral patterns intersected with the environmental cues provided by the study, hallways, and portrait-lined corridors, forming an integrated understanding of opportunity, intent, and potential concealment, and she noted how even the smallest sign, such as a shadow crossing a wall, a brief pause in conversation, or a minor disturbance of objects, could illuminate the hidden dynamics of Ashcroft Manor. By midnight, Miss Marple had mapped a network of observation, movement, and concealment. Chapter 17. Shadows in the Conservatory. As the first light of dawn filtered weakly through the tall, narrow windows of Ashcroft Manor, the conservatory, usually a place of calm reflection, filled with the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft scent of blooms, took on an unfamiliar air, the shadows stretching long across the patterned floor, and Miss Marple, seated quietly in a shaded corner, observed with her usual patient attentiveness, noting the slight shifts in plant placement, the irregularities in the sun-dappled light, and the faint traces of recent disturbance among the pots and decorative urns, all of which suggested that someone had passed through the space with a purpose beyond mere care or admiration, and she considered how these environmental cues, when integrated with her meticulous observations of human behavior, gestures, and micro-expressions elsewhere in the manor, might illuminate movements, opportunities, and concealed intentions connected to the ongoing mystery sparked by the funeral invitation. Each fallen leaf, displaced fern, or faint smudge on the polished tiles formed part of a larger pattern that she catalogued in her mind, understanding that the seemingly trivial evidence of presence could reveal far more than words ever could. The conservatory doors, heavy and ornate, showed subtle marks on their frames, slight abrasions that suggested repeated contact, and Miss Marple mentally traced the possible routes of access and egress, noting how the interplay of natural light, reflections in the glass panes, and shadowed corners might provide cover for clandestine movement, observation, or manipulation. And she linked these details to earlier observations of disturbances in hallways, the misalignment of furniture, and the fleeting gestures she had catalogued among staff, family members, and visitors, creating a comprehensive map of awareness, opportunity, and concealed activity. Beyond the physical traces, she considered the psychological dimension of the conservatory's recent disturbances, noting how individuals' interactions with this space, hesitation before entering, sudden changes in posture, careful attention to the placement of objects, and subtle monitoring of light and shadow, revealed anxiety, suppressed knowledge, or deliberate concealment, and how these behavioral cues, when combined with environmental anomalies, could indicate prior observation, secretive action, or intent to hide or retrieve significant items, such as letters, documents, or personal effects connected to the funeral invitation and its hidden implications. Miss Marple's attention then turned to the structural details: the slight warp of a window sill, the uneven placement of paving stones beneath the fern stands, the faint discoloration of tiles near the far wall, and the way shadows fell across the floor at different angles, all providing subtle yet telling indications of movement, weight, and timing. She imagined the sequence of actions that could produce these effects, linking each subtle clue to known behaviors, prior routines, and potential motives, and integrating them into a broader understanding of the manor's hidden activity throughout the night. The plants themselves became a source of silent testimony: a drooping leaf here, a slightly tilted pot there, a faint scratch on a ceramic stand, and Miss Marple catalogued these signs in conjunction with previous disturbances noted in other rooms, recognizing that the careful orchestration of such seemingly insignificant details could be used to obscure activity, misdirect observers, or conceal evidence. And she interpreted each alteration as a potential signal of human presence, choice, or intent, forming a layered narrative of movement, opportunity, and hidden purpose that extended across the manor. In addition to physical and behavioral clues, auditory signals played a subtle yet critical role, and Miss Marple's acute awareness of the conservatory's acoustics allowed her to detect the faintest echoes, the almost imperceptible shift in sound as someone had stepped across tiles or brushed past foliage, and the subtle creak of window frames or furniture, all of which she mapped mentally, integrating them with visual cues to reconstruct the likely pathways, timings, and motivations of those who had traversed this space, particularly in relation to the secrets contained within the locked study, the portraits, and the other rooms affected by the funeral invitation's implications. Every minor gesture, too, contributed to the larger picture: a hand lingering on a railing, a hesitant step toward a display, a momentary glance toward the windows, and Miss Marple recorded each micro-expression and subtle movement, interpreting it in context with previous observations of posture, speech patterns, and behavioral anomalies, and understanding how these intersected with environmental cues to indicate knowledge, awareness, or intent that had yet to be disclosed. The convergence of these signals formed a layered, intricate web that revealed both the physical and psychological landscape of Ashcroft Manor in the wake of hidden secrets, suppressed motives, and concealed actions. Throughout the morning, she also considered the interplay between light, shadow, and observation, noting how the changing angles of sunlight could highlight or obscure minor disturbances, reveal hidden paths, or manipulate perception, and she traced the implications of these environmental factors for the movements and awareness of household members, visitors, and potential suspects, integrating this with behavioral cues to anticipate possible interactions, concealed intentions, and the unfolding sequence of events that had been set into motion by the arrival of the funeral invitation. Miss Marple's analysis extended beyond immediate observation to encompass historical context. The known habits, interpersonal dynamics, rivalries, and unspoken tensions among family members and staff, understanding how these long-standing patterns could influence present behavior, guide decision-making, and determine who might have sought access to the conservatory or other sensitive spaces, what they might have observed, and what they intended to conceal, remove, or discover. Every interaction, gesture, and subtle shift in posture became meaningful when interpreted through the lens of accumulated knowledge and patient, careful deduction. As she studied the conservatory, Miss Marple also reflected on timing and sequence, mapping how access to this space could have been achieved without detection, the likely routes taken by different individuals, and the subtle manipulations of environment that would facilitate concealment or observation, integrating these with her earlier analyses of movement through the study, hallways, and portrait-lined corridors, and the interactions noted among staff and guests, creating a cohesive, multi-layered understanding of activity, intent, and opportunity, all of which would ultimately inform the revelation of hidden truths, motives, and relationships. Even the smallest signals, slight smudges on glass, displaced soil in pots, faint scratches on tiles, brief shadows crossing the floor, were catalogued with meticulous care, and Miss Marple considered how these intersected with behavioral and historical evidence to reveal who had been present, what actions they had taken, and how their awareness, intent, and concealment could be inferred from the interplay of these diverse clues. The synthesis of these elements, both tangible and intangible, allowed her to construct a detailed. Chapter 18. The Whisper Beneath the Floorboards. The manor had settled into an uneasy quiet by late afternoon, the kind of stillness that felt less like peace and more like an exhale held too long, trembling at the edges, and Miss Marple, moving with her gentle, deliberate steps, allowed herself to be guided not by sight but by a careful weaving of instinct, accumulated observation, and subtle shifts in the manor's atmosphere, which had changed since the conservatory's revelations, becoming heavier, as though the walls themselves strained to hold secrets too long suppressed, their weight pressing against the air in every corridor. She made her way toward the east wing, an older part of Ashcroft Manor seldom visited by family or staff, where the wallpaper had yellowed, the wooden banisters creaked under the slightest pressure, and dust collected in soft layers that spoke of years of neglect rather than simple oversight. Yet Miss Marple sensed that this wing was far from forgotten, for she had noticed, over the past day, subtle signs of recent passage, disturbed dust, faint footprints softened by careful rubbing, and a shift in the air's temperature that suggested drafts from recently opened doors or windows. These signs, minor to any casual observer, were for Miss Marple tangible indicators of hidden activity, and she followed them like a thread, tracing patterns that aligned curiously with the timeline of the funeral invitation's arrival and the subtle changes in demeanor she had noted among household members, particularly those whose glances lingered too long on doorways or whose hands trembled when certain topics arose. The east wing corridor narrowed toward the back, where an old runner carpet, threadbare in places, bore a faint indentation on its right side as though someone had paced there repeatedly, pausing at irregular intervals, and Miss Marple lowered her gaze to the floorboards beneath the frayed edges of the carpet, noting the slightest irregularity, a bowing of wood, a shift in grain pattern, a minute elevation, so subtle as to be invisible unless one specifically sought it. She pressed her foot gently against one of the boards, and though her weight was light, the wood yielded just enough to confirm her suspicion. Beneath the carpet lay not merely worn flooring but a hidden cavity, one that had likely been used recently. Her mind retraced every behavioral clue, glances exchanged between family members after the funeral invitation arrived, the nervous tapping of a cane by Mr. Hargreave, the sharp hesitation in Mrs. Elwood's voice when referencing the east rooms, and the way two of the younger staff members always avoided the corridor entirely, and she understood that this place held something rooted deeply in the family's past, something resurfaced only because the funeral invitation had stirred long-forgotten tensions to life. Kneeling slowly, ignoring the ache in her joints, Miss Marple lifted the edge of the carpet with careful, almost reverent precision, revealing a narrow floorboard whose nails had been loosened and reinserted without the firm pressure of a carpenter's hand. Delicately, she pressed a fingertip along the side, feeling the soft give of the board, and then pried it up just enough to slip 2 fingers beneath and raise it silently. The cavity beneath was narrow but long, the wood enclosing a shallow compartment, and within it rested 3 objects whose presence immediately revealed the weight of history concealed there: an old, dust-covered photograph frame, a folded, yellowing letter sealed with wax bearing a family crest, and a thin silver bracelet etched with initials worn nearly smooth by time and handling. Each item radiated significance, not through dramatic appearance but through careful concealment, and Miss Marple understood that these were not trinkets forgotten or discarded. They had been placed here intentionally, hidden with purpose. She examined the photograph first, wiping away dust to reveal an image taken decades earlier. A young woman, striking, serene, standing beside a man whose posture seemed both proud and wary, and though the photograph bore no names, Miss Marple recognized a resemblance in the woman's eyes to a current member of the household, a detail that aligned with odd fragments of hushed conversation she had overheard earlier, references to an inheritance, old mistakes, and a promise unkept. She then turned her attention to the letter, still sealed though brittle with age, its edges fraying, and though she did not break its seal, respecting that such an item demanded timing and context, she noted the slight depression in the wax, the subtle unevenness that suggested it had been opened and resealed once before, not professionally but by a trembling, inexperienced hand, likely years ago. That discovery led her mind to conclusions she did not voice aloud. Someone had known of this compartment long before, someone had returned to it recently, and someone had a reason to conceal objects that connected the family's past to the current mysteries surrounding the funeral invitation. The bracelet, though on first glance the simplest item, spoke with perhaps the greatest eloquence. Its worn initials, E.H., suggested a name long whispered in the manor's history, a name Miss Marple recalled hearing in fragments of gossip exchanged among older villagers, stories of a scandal never fully explained, of a relationship that had fractured alliances within the Ashcroft lineage, and she connected these details to the present tensions, sensing how old wounds might have been reopened by the arrival of the invitation, which had clearly not merely summoned mourners but stirred ghosts long confined to memory. As she carefully returned the items to their hiding place, documenting their arrangement, their condition, and the precise positioning of each object, she heard the faintest change in the air behind her, a subtle shift recognizable not as a physical movement but as the quiet of someone holding their breath. She did not turn immediately, instead allowing her awareness to settle across the corridor, tracing the reflection in the distant glass pane to confirm the presence of a shadow standing just out of sight, someone who had approached silently, observing her actions with a mixture of fear and desperation. "It's quite all right," Miss Marple said gently, still facing the open floorboard, her voice calm and steady as though she were merely commenting on the weather. "You needn't worry. I've touched nothing that cannot be understood when one looks at the truth plainly." The silence behind her quivered, and she sensed the shift of weight from one foot to another, the tremor of uncertainty, the hesitation of someone wrestling with the instinct to flee. "The truth," she continued softly, "has a way of resurfacing, no matter how carefully one tries to bury it. And it seems it has chosen today to do so." At last there was movement, a slow, reluctant step forward, the kind that carried the weight of years of fear, and Miss Marple turned her head just enough to glimpse the figure's outline reflected dimly in the glass. Thin shoulders, trembling hands, and eyes filled not with guilt but with dread, the kind born of secrets held too long. She offered a gentle nod, her expression softening. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "you might tell me why these things were hidden, and why they matter now." Chapter 19. The Silence Before. The storm, the morning air in Rose Hill felt unusually heavy, as though the entire village was holding its breath. Clouds hung low, swallowing the sky in a quiet, colorless gloom. Miss Marple woke early, her mind already sifting through the events of the past day like lace threads that refused to lie flat. She boiled water for tea, her hand steady, but her thoughts far from calm. Something had shifted last night, not outwardly, not in any obvious way, but within the delicate balance of lies and half-truths that the villagers had been spinning around themselves. Someone had slipped. Someone had revealed more than they meant to. And Miss Marple, as always, had noticed. She dressed in a neat blue cardigan and stepped outside just as the church bells began to ring. Not their usual peaceful chime. Today the sound felt sharp, echoing against the quiet streets. A few villagers were already out, Mrs. Trelawney sweeping her front step with nervous energy, Mr. Hopkins checking his watch over and over as though time itself had offended him. Everyone felt it. A tension they couldn't name. As Miss Marple made her way down the lane, Constable Finch hurried toward her, his face pale. "Miss Marple, I was just about to call upon you." Her eyes softened with concern. "More news, Constable." Finch swallowed hard. "It's Mrs. Ellington. She claims she heard voices last night in the churchyard. Arguing. Quite late." "Voices?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Men or women?" "Two men, she thinks. Said one sounded angry enough to kill." Miss Marple paused only a second, but Finch saw the flicker in her expression. "She also mentioned," Finch continued, "that she heard someone say the name Henry." Rose Hill had no shortage of Henrys. Henry Porter, the grocer's son. Henry Fielding, recently returned from London after a suspiciously abrupt resignation. And Henry Blair, the deceased Mr. Blair's estranged nephew. Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed with delicate intensity. "Constable, may I speak with Mrs. Ellington myself?" Finch nodded quickly. "Of course. But there's something else. Inspector Graves has decided to bring in Henry Blair for questioning." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "How very premature." Finch looked uncomfortable. "Graves thinks it's the safest bet." "Yes," she replied softly, "but the safest bet is rarely the correct one." Miss Marple visited Mrs. Ellington shortly after. The elderly widow sat wrapped in a shawl, hands trembling around a teacup. "I didn't want to cause trouble, Miss Marple," she stammered, "but I couldn't sleep. And I do swear, I heard them right outside the old yew tree." Miss Marple rested a comforting hand over hers. "You did the right thing. Tell me, dear, were you frightened?" "Yes," Mrs. Ellington whispered, "because one of the men sounded familiar." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Familiar how?" "A voice one hears often in the village," the old woman said hesitantly. "But I can't place whose." This, Miss Marple knew, was important. And dangerous. She stayed a bit longer, offering reassurance, but her thoughts were racing. Someone in Rosehill had been meeting secretly. Someone connected to the crime. And someone who believed they were clever enough to remain unseen. But Miss Marple had seen too many frightened widows, too many whispered secrets, too many small sins hidden under polite smiles. By midday, Rosehill was buzzing. Rumors spread like wildfire. "Henry Blair is being arrested. I heard he fought with his uncle before the funeral. They say he needed money. He's the perfect suspect." Perfect suspects were rarely real killers. Miss Marple walked calmly through the center of the commotion, her expression unreadable. Not because she was unsure. Not because she doubted her instincts. But because she sensed the truth beginning to move, quietly, dangerously, like a shadow slipping through a doorway. That evening, as the village settled under a restless dusk, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, notebook in her lap. She wrote down names, motives, opportunities, lies that didn't match, and conversations that lingered too long. When she finished, she closed the notebook and looked toward the darkening sky. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "the facade will crack." And in Rosehill, somewhere in a silent house, the real killer felt, for the first time, a shiver of fear. Miss Marple had begun closing in. And there was no escape. Chapter 20. The Net Tightens. A cold drizzle settled over Rosehill the next morning, turning the village into a watercolor of gray roofs, wet cobblestones, and breath fogging in the air. The kind of morning, Miss Marple thought, when people stayed indoors unless they had something urgent to hide, or something urgent to discover. She stepped out with her umbrella held neatly above her steps steady, purposeful. She felt it, the shift. The killer was no longer confident. Someone had begun to make mistakes. And Miss Marple intended to find every single one. The village rumors turned dark by the time she reached the baker's shop. Whispers hung thicker than the mist. "They say Henry Blair nearly confessed. Inspector Graves thinks its case closed. Miss Marple disagrees. I can tell from her face. If she disagrees, then it isn't over." Miss Marple walked past each conversation without interruption, though she heard every word. The villagers trusted her intuition more than the police, and they were right to. At the bakery counter, young Emily Turner leaned forward anxiously. "Miss Marple, have you heard? They've taken Henry to the station." And he looked absolutely terrified. Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "Fear does not always come from guilt, my dear. Sometimes it comes from knowing something dangerous, and being too frightened to speak." Emily swallowed. "You think he knows who did it?" Miss Marple didn't answer directly. "I think Henry Blair is hiding something, but not the crime." Miss Marple's quiet investigation. Instead of going home, Miss Marple made her way toward the Blair family estate. The old house loomed, dark and shuttered, its gardens untended since the funeral. Miss Marple walked the grounds slowly, observing, listening. Then, near the back entrance, something caught her eye, barely visible in the wet soil. Footprints. Fresh ones. Too large to belong to Henry Blair. Too deep for a woman's step. Someone had been here. Recently. In a hurry. She bent down, touching the edge of the print. The direction mattered. Whoever it was had approached the house, not left it. Miss Marple's calm eyes scanned the area, and found something else. A broken twig. A torn thread of dark wool caught on a fence wire. "Not Henry," she murmured. Someone else had come to the Blair estate after the funeral. Someone who didn't want to be seen. At the police station, Inspector Graves was already irritated before Miss Marple arrived. She could tell from the way he paced the hallway, muttering under his breath. "Miss Marple," he said tightly, "if you're here to defend Henry Blair, I must insist—" "I'm not here to defend him, Inspector," she replied softly. "I'm here to prevent a mistake." Graves stiffened. "A mistake." She folded her hands calmly. "If you charge Henry Blair now, you will let the real murderer walk free." Graves looked as though he swallowed a thorn. "Do you have proof of that?" "Proof? No." "Evidence?" "Yes." She described the footprints. The torn clothing thread. The direction of the steps. The clear signs that someone else had visited the estate, someone larger, someone purposeful. Graves' jaw tightened. Why would anyone go back there? To hide something, she said. Or to retrieve something they regret leaving behind. He hesitated. Miss Marple, are you suggesting the killer returned to the scene? She gave a polite, chilling smile. I'm suggesting, Inspector, that the killer has begun to panic. A dangerous turn later that afternoon, as the rain faded into a restless wind, Miss Marple returned home to find an unexpected envelope slid under her door. No name. No stamp. Just a single sheet of paper inside. A message written in uneven, shaky handwriting. Stop asking questions. If you value your life, let this go. Miss Marple's face remained calm. But inside, a truth solidified. This was no random threat. This was desperation. The killer had realized Miss Marple was closing in, and they were frightened enough to warn her off. She folded the paper neatly and set it on her table. I've struck a nerve, she whispered. And that meant only one thing. She was getting close. Very close. The final layers of deception were beginning to peel away. Tomorrow, she knew, someone would break, whether from fear, guilt, or the weight of their own lies. And Miss Marple would be there to catch every falling piece.